The first thing anyone noticed about Blackthorne Keep was not its architecture, not the towers that clawed at the winter sky like iron fingers, not the walls thick enough to withstand siege cannons, not even the gates that groaned like dying men when they opened. It was the silence. The kind of silence that existed only in places where fear had soaked so deeply into the stone that even the wind learned to whisper. Where servants moved through corridors like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by generations of terror compressed into muscle memory. Where laughter died in throats before it could reach the air. Duke Vaelor Blackthorne stood at the window of his war chamber, 6 stories above the northern cliffs, watching the convoy approach through the snow. 3 carriages, 40 armed guards. Banners bearing the silver falcon of House Veil, snapping in the wind like distress signals. His bride was arriving. He felt nothing. Behind him, Lord Corvin Thrace cleared his throat. The sound was careful, measured. Everything about Thrace was measured. 20 years as Vaelor's chief advisor had taught him that survival meant never surprising the Duke. The contracts have been signed, Your Grace. Lady Seraphine's dowry includes the eastern trade routes, mineral rights to the Silver Peak Mountains, and political alliance with the 4 southern duchies. The marriage will make Ravaryn the most powerful dominion in the kingdom.
But is
Vaelor did not turn from the window. And the girl? 23 years old, educated at the Royal Academy, speaks 4 languages, known for her. Opinions on reform. That final word hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. Vaelor's reflection in the glass showed nothing. No expression, no interest. Just the sharp angles of a face that had forgotten how to soften, crowned by black hair pulled back with military precision. His eyes were the color of slate before a storm, the kind that made men look away instinctively. Opinions? He repeated quietly. Thrace shifted his weight. A tell. The advisor was worried. She has written to Parliament, twice, advocating for tenant rights and labor reforms. Nothing treasonous, but she believes her bloodline gives her permission to have a conscience. Vaelor finally turned from the window. How inconvenient. The war chamber was exactly what its name suggested. Maps covered every wall, marked with troop movements, resource allocations, political vulnerabilities. The table at the center was scarred from decades of daggers being slammed into wood during heated debates. 3 chairs surrounded it. There used to be 12. Vaelor had removed the others himself. Too many voices diluted clarity. Too many opinions created weakness. In Ravaryn, decisions were not debated. They were handed down like commandments, and the only acceptable response was obedience. He moved to the table, his gloved hand spreading across the largest map. Ravaryn stretched from the frozen wastes in the north to the merchant cities along the southern coast. Every village, every fortress, every mile of road had been carved into submission by 3 generations of Blackthorns. This marriage was not my preference, Vaelor said, his voice carrying the same emotion he might use to discuss crop rotations. But the southern duchies control resources we need. Veil brings legitimacy to our expansion. The girl is irrelevant beyond her signature and her womb. Thrace nodded slowly. And if she proves difficult? Vaelor looked up. The question did not require an answer, and they both knew it. The Duke had married once before. That wife had lasted 7 months before she threw herself from the eastern tower. No one spoke about it. Not because Vaelor forbade the topic, but because the truth was more terrifying than any rumor. Lady Marguerite Blackthorne had not been mistreated. She had not been beaten or starved or locked away. She had simply realized, with the awful clarity of someone who understands they are already dead, that living beside Vaelor Blackthorne was a form of suffocation. The castle did not kill her. The Duke's presence did. "Have the southern wing prepared," Vaelor ordered. "She will have her own quarters, her own staff, her own schedule. She is to attend court functions as required. Beyond that, she is free to occupy herself however she wishes." It was the most generous arrangement anyone at Blackthorne Keep had heard in a decade. Thrace bowed. "Very gracious, Your Grace." Vaelor returned his attention to the maps. "It is strategic. A caged bird sings louder than one given space to fly. I have no interest in managing her emotional deterioration. Keep her occupied, keep her distant, and make certain she understands the cost of public defiance." The advisor departed, leaving Vaelor alone in the war chamber. Beyond the windows, the convoy had reached the outer gates. The Duke did not watch the carriages enter his domain. He had already dismissed Lady Seraphine Vael from his mind, the same way he dismissed every other necessary inconvenience in his life. She was a political tool, nothing more. The throne room of Blackthorne Keep was designed to break spirits. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadows that no amount of candlelight could penetrate. Columns of black marble rose like executioners standing at attention. The floor was polished obsidian, so perfectly reflective that those who walked across it saw their own distorted images staring back, as if the castle itself judged them from below. At the far end, elevated on a dais of stone, sat the iron seat. Not iron by material, but by reputation. The throne had been carved from a single piece of granite pulled from the Dead Mountain quarry, where 300 men had died during its extraction. Every Duke of Ravaryn had ruled from that chair for 200 years, and every one of them had understood the same fundamental truth. Power was not granted. It was taken and defended with absolute brutality. 200 nobles filled the throne room, arranged in careful hierarchies that had been established through generations of bloodshed and political annihilation. The highest houses stood closest to the dais. The lesser families crowded near the walls, grateful simply to be present. Everyone wore their finest silks and jewels. Everyone smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. Everyone understood that court gatherings at Blackthorne Keep were performances where the wrong word could end a bloodline. Vaelor entered from the western corridor. The room did not fall silent because someone commanded it. It fell silent because his presence demanded it. He walked with the measured pace of someone who had never needed to hurry, who understood that the world waited for him rather than the reverse. His formal court attire was black trimmed with silver, the colors of House Blackthorne. No crown, no ostentatious jewelry, no decorations. He did not need them. The Duke ascended to the iron seat and stood before it, not sitting, his gaze sweeping across the assembly with the clinical assessment of a man cataloging assets and liabilities. "Lord Chancellor," he said quietly. An elderly man near the front stepped forward, bowing so deeply his forehead nearly touched the floor. "Your Grace." "The contracts. Signed and witnessed, Your Grace. The marriage is legally binding upon Lady Vael's arrival." Vaelor nodded once. "Then let us dispense with ceremony and proceed to the essential matter." He finally sat, and the room exhaled collectively. "Ravaryn does not engage in romantic tradition," Vaelor continued, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vast chamber. "This alliance serves strategic interests. House Vael brings resources. We provide stability and protection. That is the transaction. I expect every family present to understand that Lady Seraphine will be afforded the respect her position demands, and nothing more. She is not your confidant. She is not your ally. She is the Duchess of Ravaryn, and her function is political." Several nobles exchanged glances. This was not how marriages were typically announced. But this was also Vaelor Blackthorne, and normal rules had stopped applying to him years ago. "Furthermore," the Duke said, leaning forward slightly, "any family that believes this marriage represents an opportunity to curry favor through manipulation of the Duchess will find themselves reassessing that strategy from significantly reduced circumstances. Lady Vael answers to me. Not to your ambitions, not to your schemes. Is that understood?" 200 heads nodded in perfect unison. "Excellent." Vaelor stood. "Then we are finished here." He descended from the dais and walked toward the main doors, the crowd parting before him like water around stone. And that was when Lady Seraphine Vael entered the throne room. She appeared in the archway at the exact moment Vaelor reached it, and for 3 full seconds, neither moved. The nobles held their breath. Seraphine was not beautiful in the delicate, performative way court ladies cultivated. She was striking in the manner of something sharp, something that demanded attention not through softness, but through refusal to be ignored. Dark hair pulled back severely, eyes the color of winter frost. A traveling dress that was elegant but practical, designed for function rather than display. And she did not lower her gaze. Every servant in Blackthorne Keep had learned within their first week that direct eye contact with the Duke was an invitation for punishment. Every noble knew that prolonged eye contact was a challenge that could end bloodlines. Seraphine looked directly at Vaelor and did not blink. The Duke stopped 1 pace away from her. Up close, she could see what the stories had failed to capture. Vaelor Blackthorne was not handsome in any traditional sense. His face was too angular, too severe, carved from bone and will rather than genetics. But there was a magnetic gravity to him, the way black holes possessed beauty, not in spite of their danger, but because of it. "Lady Vael," he said quietly. "Your Grace." Her voice was steady, controlled, completely absent of the nervousness that should have been present. Vaelor's eyes narrowed fractionally. "You are punctual. I appreciate efficiency. And you are exactly as described," Seraphine replied. "I appreciate consistency." The throne room remained frozen. No one spoke to the Duke like that. No one matched his tone. No one treated a first meeting as if they stood on equal ground. Vaelor's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger. Something more complex. Something that resembled curiosity emerging from hibernation. "We will speak privately," he said, gesturing toward the corridor. "Of course." Seraphine moved past him into the hallway, her posture straight, her steps measured. As the massive doors closed behind them, Thrace appeared at Vaelor's shoulder. "That," the advisor whispered, "is not a caged bird." Vaelor said nothing, but for the first time in 5 years, something other than cold calculation stirred in his chest. Interest. The private study was smaller than the war chamber, but no less severe. Bookshelves lined with military histories and political treatises. A fireplace burning low. 2 chairs facing each other across a small table. Vaelor gestured for Seraphine to sit. She remained standing. "I prefer to stand during negotiations," she said simply. "This is not a negotiation. This is a marriage." "Every marriage is a negotiation, Your Grace. The question is whether both parties are honest about the terms." Vaelor moved to the window, his back to her. "You were educated at the Royal Academy, top of your class in political theory. Published 3 papers on economic reform before you turned 22. You believe power should be distributed rather than concentrated. You think suffering can be legislated away through progressive policy." He turned to face her. "You are an idealist. And you," Seraphine countered, "have ruled Ravaryn through fear for a decade. Your policies have crushed rebellions, eliminated rival houses, and created an economy that functions solely because people are too terrified to fail. You believe mercy is weakness and compassion is a luxury reserved for the powerless." She took a step closer. "You are a tyrant." The room became very quiet. Vaelor should have ended the conversation immediately. Should have had her removed, her tongue cut out, her family stripped of titles for such insolence. Instead, he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator recognizing something unexpected in its territory. "Good," he said softly. "If you had arrived here trembling and grateful, I would have been disappointed. Ravaryn does not need another decoration. It needs someone who understands that survival requires brutality. I understand brutality, Your Grace. I simply do not worship it." "Then you will learn." Vaelor moved closer, towering over her by nearly a foot. "This is not the Academy. This is not a debate hall where ideas compete on equal ground. This is Ravaryn, and in Ravaryn, only one philosophy matters. Yours." "Precisely." Seraphine did not retreat. "And if I refuse to accept that philosophy?" Vaelor leaned down until his face was level with hers, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Then you will join the very long list of people who learned too late that I do not tolerate defiance." For the first time since entering Blackthorne Keep, Seraphine felt genuine fear. Not because of his words, because of the absolute certainty in his eyes. This was not a man who made empty threats. This was not a man who engaged in performative cruelty for effect. This was someone who had reduced resistance to mathematics, who calculated suffering the way others calculated profit, who saw human life as a resource to be managed rather than a gift to be cherished. But beneath that fear, something else stirred. Anger. "Then we understand each other," Seraphine said quietly. "You rule through terror, and I will spend every day reminding everyone in this castle that terror is not the same as respect." Vaelor straightened, his expression returning to its default neutrality. "You may try." He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "Your quarters are in the southern wing. Dinner is served at 8. Attendance is required. Wear something appropriate. Define appropriate." Boix ichaishiskat, something that reminds the court you are mine. The door closed behind him. Seraphine stood alone in the study, her hands trembling now that she was no longer being observed. She had just declared war on the most dangerous man in the kingdom. And the terrifying part was not that she had done it. It was that some part of her had enjoyed it. 3 weeks passed. Blackthorne Keep operated according to rhythms that had been established long before Seraphine's arrival, and would continue long after her inevitable departure. Servants moved through corridors at precise times. Meals were served with military punctuality. Court sessions followed schedules that had not changed in decades. Everything was controlled. Everything was predictable. Everything was suffocating. Seraphine discovered quickly that being Duchess of Ravaryn meant occupying a position of theoretical power with no actual authority. She attended dinners where nobles smiled at her with dead eyes. She sat through council meetings where her presence was acknowledged, but her opinions were ignored. She walked through gardens where even the flowers seemed too afraid to bloom properly. And through it all, Vaelor watched. Not obviously, not constantly, but she felt his attention the way someone feels eyes on them in a dark room. At dinners, his gaze would linger on her face when she spoke. During council meetings, he would pause fractionally when she shifted in her seat. In hallways, she would turn to find him standing motionless 30 paces away, observing her with the same clinical interest a scientist might show a specimen that refused to behave as predicted. It was maddening. On the 23rd day, Seraphine made her first significant move. A tenant farmer named Willem Corday had been brought before the Duke's magistrate for failing to meet his grain quotas. The punishment, according to Ravaryn law, was forfeiture of land and indentured servitude for his entire family. Seraphine attended the hearing. The courtroom was a smaller chamber attached to the main keep, designed for dispensing justice with mechanical efficiency. The magistrate, a skeletal man named Petros Vane, sat behind an elevated desk reviewing documents with the enthusiasm of someone reading a shopping list. Willem stood in chains before him, mid-40s, weathered face, hands that had spent decades working soil. Willem Corday, Vane read monotonously. Failure to deliver contracted grain quantities for 3 consecutive months. Total shortfall, 40 bushels. How do you plead? Guilty, Your Honor. Willem's voice cracked. But the drought. Drought is not recognized as legal justification for contract violation. Vane made a notation. Sentence is forfeiture of lands and indenture for household members. Duration, 7 years. Next case. No. The single word cut through the courtroom like a blade through silk. Everyone turned. Seraphine stood from her seat at the back of the room. Vane blinked. Your Grace, this is a closed proceeding. This is a travesty. Seraphine walked forward, her heels clicking against stone. You are punishing a man for circumstances beyond his control. The drought affected the entire Northern Territory. His neighbors faced identical shortfalls. Those neighbors met their obligations through supplemental means. You mean they borrowed from predatory lenders at interest rates that will bankrupt them within 2 years? Seraphine reached the front of the courtroom. I have reviewed the agricultural reports. Willem Corday has been a model tenant for 18 years. 1 season of hardship should not result in the destruction of his family. Vane's expression hardened. The law is clear, Your Grace. Contracts must be honored. Then the law is barbaric. The magistrate stood, his face flushing. These are Duke Blackthorne's statutes, established through decades of fear, Seraphine finished. They were established through fear, and they are maintained through fear, and they will be remembered as monuments to cruelty. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Willem stared at the Duchess as if she had descended from a painting, some mythical figure who existed only in stories about kingdoms that no longer existed. Vane sputtered. Your Grace, I cannot simply dismiss charges because you find them distasteful. The Duke himself is not present. Seraphine smiled coldly, which means this is an excellent opportunity for you to demonstrate independent judgment. Reduce the sentence to a fine. Allow Willem to pay through labor rather than servitude. or I will personally bring this case before Parliament and ensure every member understands how Ravaryn treats its most loyal citizens. It was a bluff. Seraphine had no political capital with Parliament, no allies in the aristocracy, no leverage beyond her title, but Vane did not know that. More importantly, Vane knew that defying the Duchess openly could create complications with the Duke. The magistrate sat down slowly. Fine. Reduced to 18 months supervised labor. No indenture for family members. He slammed his gavel. Next case. Seraphine turned and walked from the courtroom without looking back. Behind her, Willem Corday wept with relief. News of the incident reached Vaelor before dinner. He listened to Thrace's report without expression, his dinner untouched before him in the private dining hall. She overruled Magistrate Vane, Thrace concluded. Publicly, in front of 20 witnesses, the magistrate is requesting guidance on how to proceed. Vaelor cut a piece of venison with surgical precision. Tell Vane to follow her ruling. The advisor paused. Your Grace? You heard me. But the precedent. If nobles believe the Duchess can overturn judicial decisions, then they will learn that the Duchess operates at my discretion, and that discretion extends to matters I deem acceptable. Vaelor finally looked up. What she did was strategically foolish. She burned political capital to save one farmer, but it revealed something useful, and that is, she is not performing compassion for court approval. She genuinely believes in it. The Duke returned to his meal. Genuine conviction is rare. Even rarer is someone willing to act on it despite obvious personal risk. Thrace frowned. You sound impressed. I am intrigued. Vaelor set down his utensils. Most people who challenge me are either suicidal or stupid. Lady Seraphine is neither, which means she has calculated that defying me is worth whatever consequences follow. And what consequences will follow, Your Grace? Vaelor stood, moving to the window overlooking the courtyard. Below, lanterns flickered in the darkness like captured stars. None, he said quietly. Yet. That single word contained volumes. The Duke was not angry about Seraphine's interference. He was waiting to see what she would do next, because for the first time in a very long time, someone in Blackthorne Keep was behaving unpredictably. And Vaelor Blackthorne had always been fascinated by problems that refused to solve themselves. The confrontation came 2 days later. Seraphine was in the castle library when Vaelor entered. She had discovered quickly that the library was the only room in Blackthorne Keep where she could breathe properly. Floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books that smelled of old leather and older secrets. Windows that let in actual sunlight. Silence that came from peace rather than fear. She was reading a treatise on agricultural reform when his shadow fell across the page. Lady Seraphine. She did not look up. Your Grace. Vaelor moved to the opposite side of the reading table, his hands clasped behind his back. I understand you have been busy. I have been performing the duties expected of a duchess. Interfering with judicial proceedings is not among those duties. Preventing injustice is everyone's duty. Seraphine finally met his gaze. Or have you forgotten that responsibility comes with power? I have forgotten nothing. Vaelor's voice remained calm, but something cold entered his eyes. Responsibility is precisely why Ravaryn's laws exist. Without harsh consequences, contracts become suggestions. Without fear of punishment, order collapses into chaos. Without mercy, order becomes tyranny. Mercy is a luxury weak kingdoms indulge before they are conquered. The Duke leaned forward, his palms flat on the table. You want to save every struggling farmer, every impoverished family, every noble cause that crosses your path. And in doing so, you would destroy the very system that allows those people to survive at all. Seraphine stood, matching his intensity. I would destroy a system that values compliance over humanity. Humanity is not a governing principle. It is a pleasant fiction people tell themselves when they are not responsible for keeping an entire population alive through winter. They stood on opposite sides of the table, separated by 3 feet and an ideological chasm that might as well have been the width of the kingdom. Tell me something, Your Grace. Seraphine's voice softened slightly. When was the last time you walked through Ravaryn's villages? Spoke with tenants without magistrates present? Saw your kingdom as something other than territory to control? Vaelor straightened. I see my kingdom exactly as it is. A collection of resources that must be managed, protected, and organized. Sentimentality does not enter the equation. And that, Seraphine said quietly, is why you rule a graveyard instead of a nation. The words hung in the air like poison. For a long moment, Vaelor said nothing. Then he walked around the table toward her. Seraphine held her ground, even as every instinct screamed at her to retreat. He stopped inches away, close enough that she could see the individual threads in his collar, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his presence. You are playing a dangerous game, Lady Seraphine. I am not playing anything. Then you are a fool. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Do you understand what I am? Do you comprehend the things I have done to maintain order in Ravaryn? I understand perfectly. You are a man who has mistaken fear for respect, compliance for loyalty, control for strength. Vaelor's jaw tightened fractionally. And you are a woman who has mistaken idealism for wisdom. You see suffering and believe compassion will solve it, but suffering is eternal. The only question is whether it serves a purpose. And your purpose is maintaining power. My purpose is ensuring Ravaryn survives. They stood in a tableau that could have been mistaken for intimacy if not for the barely restrained hostility crackling between them. Seraphine broke first, stepping back. I will not stop helping people simply because it inconveniences your political calculations, and I will not tolerate repeated undermining of my authority. Vaelor turned toward the door. You won a single battle with Magistrate Vane. Do not mistake that for winning the war. Next time you interfere with Ravaryn's justice system, I will ensure the consequences extend beyond your comfort. He paused at the threshold. Dinner, 8 o'clock. Do not be late. The door closed behind him. Seraphine remained in the library, her hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough that her knuckles went white. She had just made an enemy of her husband. And the truly terrifying part was that some reckless, self-destructive part of her wanted to push harder, to see exactly how far she could go before the Duke's infamous control finally shattered. 4 weeks into her residence at Blackthorne Keep, Lord Malrek Ashborn arrived. Ashborn represented the Southern Coalition, a collection of noble houses that had spent decades resenting Ravaryn's northern dominance. He was a politician in the truest sense of the word, calculating, charismatic, and completely amoral. Mid-50s, silver hair, expensive clothes that communicated wealth without ostentation. His visit was officially diplomatic. Unofficially, everyone understood he had come to assess weakness. The banquet held in his honor filled the great hall with 200 guests, wearing false smiles and genuine ambition. Crystal chandeliers, musicians playing chamber music, servants moving between tables with military precision. Vaelor sat at the head table, Seraphine beside him. They had not spoken in 3 days. Ashborn approached with practiced humility, bowing low. Your Grace, thank you for your hospitality. Lord Ashborn. Vaelor's tone suggested hospitality was the last thing on his mind. I trust your journey was acceptable. More than acceptable. Ashborn straightened, his gaze sliding to Seraphine and Lady Blackthorne. The stories of your beauty do not do you justice. It was a compliment designed to irritate the Duke while flattering the Duchess. Seraphine smiled politely. You are too kind, Lord Ashborn. Not at all. He gestured to the empty chair beside her. Might I? Before Vaelor could respond, Seraphine nodded. Of course. The Southern Lord sat, immediately angling his body toward her rather than the Duke. I understand you have been quite active since arriving in Ravaryn, championing tenant rights, challenging established procedures, bringing a much-needed progressive voice to Northern politics. Translation, I have heard you are undermining your husband's authority, and I would very much like to exploit that. Seraphine recognized the manipulation immediately. I have been observing, learning. There is much about Ravaryn that fascinates me, and much that could be improved, I imagine. Ashborn lowered his voice conspiratorially. Between us, Lady Blackthorne, the Southern Duchies have long believed that Ravaryn's approach to governance is outdated, excessively harsh, in need of modernization. Vaelor was watching this exchange with the intensity of someone observing an opponent's opening moves in a chess match. Ravaryn's governance has ensured stability for decades, Seraphine said carefully. Stability through fear, Ashborn countered, which is not the same as stability through genuine consent. Surely you, with your education and enlightened perspective, can see the difference. It was a trap. If Seraphine agreed, she would publicly align herself with the Duke's political enemies. If she disagreed, she would lose credibility with anyone hoping she might be an ally for reform. She chose a third option. I see many things, Lord Ashborn, including the difference between honest concern for citizens and opportunistic attempts to create political division. Ashborn's smile froze. Vaelor's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been approval. I meant no offense, Your Grace, Ashborn said smoothly. I simply hoped we might find common ground. Common ground, Seraphine repeated. You mean, you hoped I would help you undermine my husband's authority so the Southern Coalition could expand its influence into Northern territory? The surrounding conversations quieted. Ashborn's face flushed. That is a rather uncharitable interpretation. It is an accurate interpretation. Seraphine stood, forcing the Lord to stand as well. I have many disagreements with Duke Blackthorne's methods, but I am not naive enough to believe your concern for Ravaryn citizens is anything other than strategic theater. She turned to Vaelor. If you will excuse me, Your Grace, I find I have lost my appetite. Seraphine left the banquet hall. Behind her, 200 nobles processed what had just occurred. The Duchess had just publicly defended the Duke while simultaneously admitting their philosophical differences. It was the most politically sophisticated move anyone had witnessed in years. Ashborn slowly returned to his seat, his expression carefully controlled. Your wife is spirited, Your Grace. She is many things, Vaelor said quietly. Manipulable is not among them. The rest of the banquet proceeded in tense silence. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Vaelor found Seraphine in the northern tower. It was the highest point in Blackthorne Keep, accessible only by 200 stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. The chamber at the top was small, circular, with windows facing all 4 cardinal directions. She stood at the eastern window, looking out across dark mountains. That was well done, Basse, Vaelor said from the doorway. Seraphine did not turn. I did not do it for your approval. I know. He entered the chamber, stopping several feet behind her. Ashborn will return to the southern duchies and report that you are not the weakness he was hoping to exploit. Is that what I am to you? A potential weakness? Vaelor considered the question. You were, initially, and now? Now I am uncertain what you are. Seraphine finally turned to face him. I am exactly what I have always been. Someone who believes power should serve people rather than the reverse. An idealist, then, if that is what you wish to call it. They stood in the circular chamber, wind howling through the open windows. Why did you defend me? Vaelor asked. You hate what I represent. I dislike your methods. I do not hate you personally. Seraphine moved closer. And I recognize that Ashborn's concern for tenant rights was as genuine as a merchant's affection for coins. He wants to weaken Ravaryn, nothing more. So you chose the lesser evil. I chose the enemy I understand over the enemy wearing a mask. Vaelor studied her face. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, she looked less like a duchess and more like something carved from marble. Strength without softness, conviction without compromise. You should hate me, he said quietly. I have given you every reason. I reserve hatred for people who lack principles entirely. You have principles, Your Grace. They are simply brutal. And you believe you can change them. It was not a question. Seraphine smiled, and for the first time since arriving at Blackthorne Keep, it reached her eyes. I believe nothing is unchangeable, not laws, not systems, not even you. You will be disappointed. Perhaps. But I have been disappointed before. Vaelor turned to leave, then paused. Thank you. For tonight. Seraphine blinked. Did you just express gratitude? I express tactical acknowledgement of useful behavior. That is the most emotionally constipated thing I have ever heard. The Duke almost smiled. Good night, Lady Seraphine. Good night, Your Grace. After he left, Seraphine remained in the tower until dawn, watching the stars wheel overhead. For the first time since arriving in Ravaryn, she felt something other than anger or fear. She felt hope. It was a dangerous emotion in a castle built on certainty. The weeks that followed established a new dynamic. Vaelor and Seraphine circled each other like duelists trying to understand their opponent's style. He watched her continue interfering with magistrates, defending tenants, writing proposals for legal reforms. She watched him crush minor rebellions, negotiate trade agreements with surgical precision, maintain order through calculated displays of power. Neither yielded, but neither destroyed the other, either, the court noticed. Servants whispered about the Duchess, who spoke without fear. Nobles began positioning themselves strategically, uncertain whether Seraphine represented an opportunity or a threat. Rival houses waited to see if the rumored tension between Duke and Duchess would create exploitable weakness. Then the ledgers appeared. Seraphine found them in the castle archives while researching historical precedents for labor law. 3 volumes, hidden behind tax records from 40 years ago. The writing was coded, but the patterns were obvious to anyone who understood basic accounting. Children were being trafficked, not by foreign slavers, not by criminal syndicates, by Ravaryn's own nobility. 5 families, 12 estates, hundreds of children pulled from tenant farms, declared orphans through falsified documents, sold into labor camps disguised as training academies. The practice had been operating for at least 8 years, and the Duke had to have known. Seraphine brought the ledgers directly to the war chamber. Vaelor was reviewing troop deployments when she slammed the books onto his table hard enough to make ink bottles jump. Explain these, she demanded. The Duke glanced in the volumes. Where did you find them? The archives. Behind records you clearly never expected anyone to access. Seraphine's voice shook. Children, Your Grace. They are selling children. Vaelor closed the deployment maps. I am aware. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. You are aware. Seraphine spoke slowly, as if processing words in a foreign language. You have known about this, and done nothing. Ma'aputam. I have done precisely what the situation requires, which is maintaining stability while investigating. Stability? Seraphine's voice rose. You are protecting child traffickers in the name of stability? I am protecting the kingdom from collapse. Vaelor stood, his usual control fracturing. Those 5 families control critical infrastructure, transportation networks, grain distribution, military supply lines. If I move against them publicly, their allies will fracture parliament and we will have civil war within 3 months. Then let there be war. Some things are worth... Nothing is worth watching Ravaryn tear itself apart. The Duke slammed his palm on the table. You think I enjoy knowing this is happening? You believe I sleep comfortably while children suffer? I have spent 8 years building a case that will destroy those families without destroying the kingdom alongside them. Seraphine stared at him. 8 years. You have let this continue for 8 years. I have let this continue, Vaelor said through clenched teeth, because the alternative is catastrophe. Because the moment I expose them, every corrupt house in Ravaryn will panic and trigger the exact instability that allows even worse atrocities. Because sometimes the moral choice is the one that saves more people, even if it requires temporary tolerance of evil. That is not morality. That is cowardice. The word hung between them like a blade. Vaelor moved around the table with dangerous speed, backing Seraphine against the wall. I have made decisions that would break you. I have sacrificed pieces of my humanity to keep this kingdom functioning. Do not stand in my home and call me a coward, because you lack the stomach to understand what actual governance requires. Seraphine refused to retreat. And you do not stand there and tell me that protecting traffickers is governance. It is complicity. They were inches apart, both breathing hard, both pushed to edges neither had approached before. What would you have me do? Vaelor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Tell me, Lady Seraphine. You who believe compassion solves everything, should I arrest 5 families tomorrow? Watch Parliament collapse? Watch supply chains fail? Watched children starve in 10,000 homes because I needed to feel righteous about saving hundreds? Geese! I would have you choose the world you want to live in instead of the world you think you deserve. Something in Vaelor's expression cracked. For just a moment, Seraphine saw past the Duke, past the legend, past the carefully constructed fortress of brutal pragmatism. She saw a man who hated himself for the things he had convinced himself were necessary. Then the walls came back up. Vaelor stepped away. "Get out! Your Grace, get out!" Seraphine fled the war chamber. Behind her, the Duke stood alone in the room full of maps marking territories he controlled but could never truly save. And for the first time in 10 years, Vaelor Blackthorne put his head in his hands and allowed himself to feel the weight of every terrible choice he had ever made. That night, the castle bells began ringing, not the bells that marked time, the bells that marked danger. Seraphine was in her quarters when she heard them, their tone different from anything she had heard before. Lower, more urgent. The sound that meant the carefully controlled order of Blackthorne Keep had just collapsed into chaos. She threw open her door to find servants running through corridors. "What is happening?" she called to a passing maid. "Attack, Your Grace! Men inside the castle!" Seraphine's blood went cold. She ran toward the main keep, following the sounds of steel clashing against steel. Somewhere ahead, someone was screaming. Smoke began filtering through the hallways, acrid and thick. The assassination attempt Ashborn had been planning for months had finally begun, and Seraphine was running directly into the center of it. Seraphine rounded the corner of the eastern corridor just as a body hit the floor in front of her. Not a servant, a guard. Throat opened from ear to ear, blood pooling across marble that had been polished that morning by people who believed today would be ordinary. The dead man's eyes stared at nothing while his fingers still twitched around the hilt of a sword he had never gotten the chance to use. She froze for exactly 2 seconds. Then training overrode terror. The Royal Academy did not just teach political theory and economic reform. It also taught survival. How to move through hostile territory, how to assess threats, how to understand that standing still in a crisis was the same as painting a target on your chest. Seraphine grabbed the fallen guard's dagger and kept moving. The smoke was thicker ahead, pouring from somewhere near the main gallery. Screams echoed through stone corridors built to amplify sound, turning individual cries into a chorus of panic. She could hear steel meeting steel, could hear men shouting orders in voices too controlled to be defending, too precise to be anything other than attackers who had rehearsed this assault. Professional killers, inside Blackthorne Keep, which meant someone had provided them access. Someone had given them maps. Someone inside the castle had decided tonight was the night Vaelor Blackthorne died. Seraphine's mind raced through possibilities even as her feet carried her forward. Ashborn was the obvious candidate. The Southern Lord had left the castle 3 days ago, which was exactly enough time to position forces and coordinate an attack. This was not opportunistic violence. This was an execution plan down to the minute. She reached the gallery entrance and immediately understood why the smoke was so thick. The assassins had set fire to the southern wing. Flames climbed curtains that had hung in Blackthorne Keep for a century. Portraits of dead dukes curled and blackened in their frames. The heat was intense enough that Seraphine felt her skin tighten from 20 feet away. Guards fought desperately to contain the blaze, while other guards fought desperately to stay alive against men in dark clothing who moved like shadows given lethal purpose. And in the center of the gallery, surrounded by 6 attackers, stood Vaelor Blackthorne. No armor, no guards, no weapons except the sword he had pulled from a fallen attacker. Just the Duke against men who had come specifically to end him. Seraphine had seen Vaelor command courts, had seen him negotiate treaties, had seen him reduce grown men to trembling submission with nothing but his presence. She had never seen him fight. It was not elegant. It was brutal efficiency refined into art. Vaelor moved like violence had been compressed into human form. Every motion economical, every strike designed to disable or kill, no wasted energy, no hesitation. He did not fight like someone trained in swordsmanship. He fought like someone who had been forged in actual combat, where technique mattered less than the fundamental willingness to do whatever survival required. One attacker lunged. Vaelor sidestepped, drove his blade through the man's kidney, withdrew, and was already moving toward the next target before the first body hit the ground. 2 more attacked simultaneously from opposite sides. The Duke dropped into a crouch that made both strikes pass through empty air, then surged upward with his sword leading. The blade punched through the first attacker's throat. Vaelor ripped it free and used the momentum to slash across the second man's face hard enough to split bone. 3 left. The remaining assassins hesitated. They had come prepared to kill a politician, a ruler who commanded from thrones and council chambers. They had not expected a man who killed with the practiced ease of someone who had never forgotten that power was ultimately enforced through physical dominance. Vaelor did not give them time to reconsider their strategy. He attacked, not defensively, not reactively. He became the aggressor, closing distance before the assassins could coordinate. His sword was an extension of his will, and his will was absolute. He carved through them with the same cold precision he applied to everything in his life, reducing human beings to obstacles that needed removal. When the last attacker fell, Vaelor stood alone in the burning gallery. Blood covered his hands. Soot stained his face. His breathing was controlled but heavy. He looked like something pulled from nightmare, a figure that belonged in history books about ancient warlords rather than modern politics. Then his eyes found Seraphine. She stood in the archway, still holding the stolen dagger, staring at him with an expression she could not quite define. Horror at the violence, but also something else, recognition that this was who Vaelor Blackthorne truly was beneath the political performance. Not a man who chose brutality, a man who existed in a state where brutality was simply reality and everything else was decoration. Before either could speak, more attackers poured into the gallery from the western entrance. Not 6 this time, 15. Vaelor's jaw tightened. Even he could not handle those odds. Seraphine made a decision that would define everything that followed. She stepped forward. "Your Grace." Vaelor's head snapped toward her. "Get out of here. Not without you." She moved to his side, the dagger feeling impossibly small in her hand. "Where do we go?" The Duke stared at her for one full heartbeat. In that moment, Seraphine saw something shift behind his eyes. Not affection, not gratitude, something more fundamental. Acknowledgement that she had just chosen him over safety, that she had stepped into hell voluntarily because leaving him alone was not acceptable. "The eastern stairwell," Vaelor said quietly. "Stay behind me." They ran. Behind them, attackers gave chase through corridors filling rapidly with smoke. The castle was burning in multiple locations now, flames spreading with terrifying speed through rooms that had stood for 200 years. Servants fled screaming, guards fought desperate holding actions. The carefully controlled order of Blackthorne Keep had collapsed into primal chaos. Vaelor and Seraphine reached the eastern stairwell. It was completely blocked by debris. The Duke cursed, a single sharp word that Seraphine had never heard him use. He turned, assessing remaining options with the rapid calculation of someone who had spent a lifetime surviving impossible situations. "The cathedral wing," he decided. "There is a passage." An explosion ripped through the floor above them. The ceiling came down. Vaelor grabbed Seraphine and threw both of them against the wall as stone and timber crashed where they had been standing seconds before. Dust filled the air thick enough to choke on. The stairwell was completely buried now, cutting off their retreat. They were trapped in the eastern gallery with 15 armed men approaching from one direction and fire approaching from the other. Vaelor's grip on her arm was iron. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute clarity. "When they come through that archway, I am going to engage them. You're going to run toward the fire, not into it, past it. There's a servants' corridor behind the burning curtains. It will be smoke-filled, but passable. Follow it north until you reach the kitchens. From there, you can exit through the loading docks." "Towers seem quiet." Seraphine understood what he was describing. A suicide defense. Vaelor was going to hold the attackers long enough for her to escape, knowing he could not possibly survive against those numbers. "No," she said flatly. "This is not a negotiation." "Then stop negotiating." Seraphine pulled free of his grip. "You want me to run? Fine. But you are coming with me. Because I did not spend 6 weeks arguing with the most stubborn man in Ravaryn just to watch him die, pretending heroism is the same as stupidity." Vaelor stared at her. For the first time since she had met him, the Duke looked genuinely surprised. "You should hate me," he said quietly, "after what I told you about the ledgers. After everything I represent. I told you already. I reserve hatred for people without principles." Seraphine grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the flames. "Now move before I develop an exception." They ran toward the fire. The heat was intense enough that Seraphine felt her hair singe. Smoke burned her lungs. She covered her mouth with her sleeve and pushed forward, trusting that Vaelor knew the layout better than she did. Behind them, shouts indicated the attackers had reached the gallery. The servants' corridor was exactly where Vaelor said it would be. A narrow passage hidden behind what used to be expensive drapery, now burning with flames that licked at the walls. They plunged through, coughing violently as smoke overwhelmed their lungs. The passage was completely dark. Seraphine kept one hand on the wall and one hand on Vaelor's shoulder, following him through blackness broken only by the orange glow of fire behind them. They emerged in the kitchen, empty. Everyone had fled. Pots still boiled on stoves. Food lay abandoned mid-preparation. The loading dock doors stood open, revealing the courtyard beyond. Vaelor moved toward the exit, then stopped. Standing in the doorway backlit by courtyard torches was Lord Malric Ashborn. He was not alone. 30 soldiers in Southern Coalition colors filled the courtyard. Archers lined the walls. Cavalry waited at the gates. This was not just an assassination attempt. This was an invasion force that had somehow entered Blackthorne Keep without triggering any of the castle's defenses, which meant the traitors inside the walls went deeper than anyone had suspected. Ashborn smiled. "Your Grace, how fortunate. I was hoping we might have this conversation face to face." Vaelor said nothing. His hand tightened on his sword. "There is no escape," Ashborn continued, stepping into the kitchen. "My men control every exit. The castle is burning. Your guards are scattered. And Parliament is currently voting on your removal as we speak." He gestured magnanimously. "But I'm not an unreasonable man. Surrender. Abdicate. And I will allow both you and Lady Seraphine to live." It was a lie. Everyone in the kitchen understood it was a lie. Ashborn intended to kill them both regardless of surrender. The offer was merely theater designed to make what followed seem justified. "Why?" Seraphine asked. "What did Ravaryn do to earn this?" The Southern Lord's smile widened. "Ravaryn did nothing, but Duke Blackthorne has been an obstacle to progress for far too long. His brutality, his refusal to embrace reform, his insistence on maintaining a medieval approach to governance." He shook his head sadly. "The kingdom needs leadership that understands power should be distributed, that understands mercy, that understands weakness," Vaelor interrupted quietly. "You mean weakness? You want a kingdom ruled by people who will not defend it when you come to take what you want." Ashborn's expression hardened. "I want a kingdom that does not require fear to function." "Then you want a fantasy, because fear is the only universal language, the only currency that never inflates, the only tool that works on everyone from peasants to kings." Vaelor took a step forward. "You think you can rule Ravaryn through kindness and negotiation? You will be dead within a year, torn apart by the same houses you are currently allied with, because they will smell weakness the moment you hesitate to crush rebellion." "Is that what you tell yourself?" Ashborn laughed. "That your cruelty is necessary, that your tyranny is justified? I do not need to tell myself anything. I have kept Ravaryn functional for a decade. You will watch it collapse in months." The Southern Lord's hand moved to his sword. "Then I suppose we will never know. Kill them both." Soldiers flooded into the kitchen. Vaelor moved. He was outnumbered 30 to 1. He had no armor. His sword was chipped from fighting through the gallery. He was exhausted from combat and smoke inhalation, and he was still the most dangerous person in the room. The Duke did not fight like someone trying to win. He fought like someone who had already accepted death and decided to make it as expensive as possible. He became a whirlwind of controlled violence, his blade finding throats and eyes and hearts with surgical precision. Blood sprayed across kitchen walls. Men screamed, bodies fell. But there were too many. A soldier managed to get behind Vaelor, his spear raised for a killing thrust. Seraphine moved before conscious thought could stop her. She drove the stolen dagger up under the soldier's chin, punching through soft tissue into his brain. The man collapsed. She grabbed his spear and spun, using the momentum to drive the point through another attacker's chest. She had killed 2 men before her mind caught up with her hands. The Royal Academy had taught self-defense as academic exercise, controlled sparring in padded chambers where no one actually bled. This was nothing like that. This was messy and brutal and terrifying. The spear stuck in the second soldier's ribcage, and she had to plant her foot on his chest to wrench it free. Vaelor appeared beside her, breathing hard. Stay close. They fought back to back in the center of the kitchen, not as practiced partners, not with any coordination beyond the fundamental understanding that their survival depended on protecting each other. Vaelor handled the bulk of attackers with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime turning violence into mathematics. Seraphine covered his blind spots with desperate energy that compensated for lack of experience. They held. For 30 impossible seconds, they held. Then Ashborn himself stepped forward, drawing a pistol from his coat. "Enough," he said coldly. The gunshot echoed through the kitchen. Vaelor jerked backward. Blood bloomed across his shoulder. He stayed standing, but his sword arm dropped. The blade clattered against stone. His face went pale, but his expression remained controlled, locked in that terrible discipline that defined everything about him. Ashborn raised the pistol toward Seraphine. "Drop the spear, Lady Blackthorne, or I paint these walls with your brains." She dropped it. Soldiers grabbed them both, forcing them to their knees. Ashborn approached slowly, the pistol still aimed at Seraphine's head. "You could have had a good life," he told her conversationally. "The southern duchies would have welcomed you. Reformed policies, progressive leadership, everything you claim to want." He shook his head. "But you chose him, the tyrant, the monster, and now you will die beside him." Vaelor was bleeding heavily from the shoulder wound, but his eyes remained locked on Ashborn with an intensity that made the southern lord take an involuntary step backward. "You made one critical mistake," the Duke said quietly. "And what is that?" "You assumed Ravaryn would not burn everything to stop you." Ashborn laughed. "Ravaryn is mine. The castle is mine. The kingdom—" The explosion came from the northern tower. Not small, not contained. A detonation large enough that the entire castle shook. Windows shattered. The ceiling cracked. Soldiers stumbled, losing their grip on their prisoners. Then another explosion from the western armory. Then another from the southern barracks. Ashborn's face went white. "What have you done?" Vaelor smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "I told you, Ravaryn does not surrender." The Duke had rigged his own castle with demolition charges. Not as preparation for this specific attack, as preparation for any attack, because Vaelor Blackthorne was the kind of man who planned for scenarios where losing was inevitable and decided that if he fell, he would take everyone with him. The explosions were not random. They were strategic. The northern tower housed Ravaryn's treasury. The western armory held weapons and ammunition. The southern barracks contained enough black powder to level half the castle. Vaelor had just triggered them all simultaneously, because if Ashborn thought he could take Blackthorne Keep and use its resources to control the kingdom, he had fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. The Duke would rather rule ashes than let anyone else rule his legacy. Chaos erupted through the courtyard as more explosions rippled through the castle. Ashborn screamed orders, but no one was listening anymore. Soldiers fled, cavalry scattered. The carefully organized invasion force disintegrated into panic as the ground literally shook beneath their feet. Vaelor grabbed Seraphine's hand. "Run!" They ran, not toward the exits, toward the cathedral, the oldest part of Blackthorne Keep. The section built into the cliff face itself, protected by solid rock rather than mortar and stone. If any part of the castle survived what Vaelor had just triggered, it would be there. Behind them, the northern tower collapsed. The sound was apocalyptic. Stone falling against stone, steel beams snapping like kindling, dust rising in clouds thick enough to blot out the moon. Seraphine did not look back. Looking back would mean processing what Vaelor had done, processing that he had destroyed his own home rather than lose it to enemies, processing that the man beside her was capable of burning down everything rather than accepting defeat. They reached the cathedral just as the western armory detonated. The blast wave hit them from behind, throwing both of them forward through the cathedral doors. They hit the stone floor hard, rolling, momentum carrying them down the central aisle between rows of empty pews. The doors slammed shut behind them. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Seraphine realized Vaelor was not moving. She crawled to him, her body screaming in protest. The Duke lay on his back, blood soaking through his shirt from the gunshot wound. His face was gray, his breathing shallow. "Do not," she said firmly, grabbing his coat. "You dare die on me now." Vaelor's eyes focused on her with obvious effort. Dying was not part of the plan. What plan? You just destroyed your own castle. Reis. Strategic. Sacrifice. Each word came with difficulty. Ashborn cannot. Hold ruins. No resources. No legitimacy. He loses. Regardless of whether. I survive. Seraphine pressed her hand against his shoulder wound, trying to slow the bleeding. You magnificent, insane bastard! You would rather rule nothing than let anyone take what you built. Not nothing. His hand came up, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. Still have. Most important asset. What asset? You. The word hung in the air between them. Outside, the castle continued its death throes. Inside the cathedral, surrounded by stone that had survived 200 years of history, Seraphine stared down at the man who had just admitted she was more valuable to him than his entire kingdom. Why? She whispered. Why does any of this matter to you? I have done nothing but oppose you, nothing but interfere with your plans, nothing but represent everything you claim to despise. Vaelor's grip on her wrist tightened. Because you are the only person, in 10 years, who has looked at me and seen a man, instead of a weapon, who argued, instead of obeying, who chose to stay, when every rational instinct should have told you to run. His eyes locked with hers. I would burn this kingdom to ash before I let them take you from me. Not diplomacy, not duty, possession. But beneath the possession, something more fundamental. Someone who had spent a decade being feared, discovering that being seen was infinitely more powerful. You are insane, Seraphine said softly. Probably. Definitely. She leaned down until their faces were inches apart. And I am apparently just as insane, because I could have left tonight, could have run when the attack started, could have let you die and claimed I was a victim. Why did you not? Because watching you fight made me realize something. Seraphine's voice was steady despite everything burning outside. You are brutal. You are ruthless. You have made terrible choices in the name of order, but you have also survived in a world that would have destroyed anyone with actual weaknesses. And I would rather stand beside someone strong enough to be brutal than someone too weak to be anything at all. Vaelor stared at her. That, he said quietly, is the most terrifying thing anyone has ever said to me. Good, we can be terrified together. Outside voices shouted through the smoke. Ashborn's forces regrouping, searching for bodies, trying to salvage something from the disaster the invasion had become. Seraphine looked around the cathedral. We cannot stay here. There is a passage, Vaelor said, forcing himself to sit upright despite obvious pain. Behind the altar. Leads to caverns. Beneath the castle, we can reach the cliffs. And then what? Then we survive. The Duke stood, using her shoulder for support. And we take back everything Ashborn thinks. He has won. They moved toward the altar. Halfway there, the cathedral doors exploded inward. Soldiers poured through, weapons raised. At their head covered in soot and fury stood Lord Malrek Ashborn. Going somewhere, Your Grace? Vaelor pushed Seraphine behind him, drawing a knife from his boot. It was a pathetic weapon against 24 armed men. Both of them knew it. You destroyed your own castle, Ashborn continued, advancing slowly. Killed your own guards. Eliminated your own resources. All to prevent me from taking what was already mine. It was never yours, Vaelor said flatly. It is now. The Southern Lord raised his pistol again. And I am done playing games. He pulled the trigger. Seraphine moved, not consciously, not with any plan beyond the fundamental refusal to watch Vaelor die. She threw herself in front of him. The bullet hit her in the side. Pain exploded through her torso, white hot and absolute. She fell, Vaelor catching her before she hit the floor. His face appeared above hers, and for the first time since she had met him, the Duke's control completely shattered. No, the word came out strangled. No, 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 no. I am fine, Seraphine managed, though blood was already soaking through her dress. Just dramatic timing. Vaelor looked up at Ashborn. What happened next was not human. The Duke became something primal, something that existed before civilization taught men to control their violence. He moved with speed that should not have been possible for someone with a shoulder wound, closing the distance to Ashborn before anyone could react. The Southern Lord tried to raise his pistol. Vaelor ripped it from his hand and threw it aside. Then he beat Ashborn to death with his bare hands. Not quickly, not efficiently, with the raw fury of someone who had just watched the only thing he cared about get hurt because of another man's ambition. He broke bones, shattered teeth, kept hitting long after Ashborn stopped moving, kept hitting until soldiers physically dragged him off the corpse. They threw him against the altar, surrounded him with spears. Vaelor did not try to fight them, did not try to escape. He just stared at Seraphine, still lying where he had left her, blood pooling beneath her body. "Kill me," he told the soldiers quietly. "But you save her first. You get a physician. You do everything necessary to ensure she survives. Or I swear on every god that does not exist that I will haunt every man in this cathedral until your children die screaming." One of the soldiers, a lieutenant with more authority than sense, laughed. "You are in no position to make demands, Your Grace." "Then make a mistake," Vaelor said softly. "Let her die, and discover what I become when I have nothing left to lose." The threat was delivered with such absolute certainty that the lieutenant's smile died. Before anyone could respond, horns sounded outside the cathedral. Not enemy horns, Ravaryn's horns. The reinforcements Vaelor had sent for arrived 3 hours too late and exactly on time. 5,000 soldiers loyal to House Blackthorne poured into the castle courtyard. Not enough to prevent the attack, more than enough to ensure anyone still inside when they arrived would not leave alive. The Southern Coalition forces broke immediately. Some fled. Some surrendered. Some died fighting against overwhelming numbers. Within 15 minutes, the invasion force had been completely eliminated. The cathedral doors opened. Lord Thrace entered, covered in ash and blood, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had served Vaelor for 20 years. Ashborn's corpse. Seraphine bleeding on the floor. The Duke held at spear point by soldiers who suddenly realized they were fighting for a dead commander against an army that had just retaken the castle. "Drop your weapons," Thrace ordered quietly, "or my men will drop them for you." The soldiers obeyed. Vaelor was at Seraphine's side before anyone else could move. He pressed both hands against her wound, applying pressure with the desperate intensity of someone who had faced death 1,000 times, and was not about to accept it now. "Get a physician," he commanded. "Now." "Already coming, Your Grace." Thrace knelt beside them. "What happened?" Ashborn happened. Vaelor's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "Traitors inside the castle. Invasion force. They were going to execute us both. And the explosions? Necessary." Thrace absorbed this, nodded slowly, stood. "I will secure the grounds and send a message to Parliament that reports of your death were premature." He departed, shouting orders to commanders outside. Vaelor remained focused entirely on Seraphine. "Stay with me." "Not going anywhere," she whispered, "too stubborn to die in a cathedral. You took a bullet for me." "Someone had to. You were busy being heroically stupid." Despite everything, Vaelor almost smiled. "You are the most infuriating woman I have ever met." "Likewise. Except you are a man, obviously." "Obviously." Physicians burst through the cathedral doors, carrying supplies and moving with urgent efficiency. They pushed Vaelor aside gently but firmly, immediately beginning treatment. The Duke watched them work with an expression that would have been unreadable to anyone who did not know him, but Seraphine knew him now. She had seen past the legend to the man beneath. And what she saw was someone who had just realized that caring about anything made you vulnerable in ways that no amount of strategic planning could prevent. One of the physicians looked up. "The bullet missed vital organs. She will survive, but she needs rest and monitoring." Vaelor did not respond. He just stood there, blood covering his hands, his castle burning outside, his entire world reduced to the simple fact that she would survive. And for the first time in 10 years, Duke Vaelor Blackthorne allowed himself to feel relief. Dawn came slowly to Blackthorne Keep. The fires had been contained but not extinguished. Smoke still rose from collapsed wings, Bodies littered the courtyards. The northern tower was gone completely, reduced to rubble that would take months to clear. The western armory was a crater. The southern barracks looked like something a god had stepped on. The castle that had stood for 200 years lay in ruins. But the cathedral remained. And in the cathedral, protected by stone that had survived longer than nations, Seraphine woke to find Vaelor sitting beside her bed. He had not left, had not slept, had not changed clothes, had simply sat in that chair through the entire night, watching her breathe as if afraid that looking away would cause her to stop. "You look terrible," Seraphine said, her voice rough. "You were shot." Vaelor's response was matter-of-fact. "You nearly died. I looked appropriate for the circumstances." "How long?" 6 hours since the physicians finished. 3 hours since Parliament received confirmation I was alive. 1 hour since Thrace reported all enemy forces eliminated or captured. Always precise. Always controlled. Even when exhausted and covered in blood. "The castle?" Seraphine asked. "Destroyed. 30% structurally unsound. Another 40% damaged beyond immediate use. We will need to relocate to the winter residence while rebuilding." He said it with the same emotion someone might use to discuss weather patterns. "You destroyed your own home," Seraphine said softly. "Your legacy. Everything House Blackthorne built." "No." Vaelor finally met her eyes. "I destroyed buildings, stone and timber and decoration. House Blackthorne is not architecture. It is will. And will cannot be burned." Seraphine studied his face. "You're going to use this, are you not? The attack, the invasion, Ashborn's death. You are going to turn it into something that makes you stronger." Parliament is already voting on emergency powers. The Southern Coalition is fractured. Noble houses that stayed neutral during the attack are scrambling to prove loyalty. Vaelor leaned back in his chair. "By the end of the week, I will have more authority than any Duke of Ravaryn has held in 50 years. Because you turned an assassination attempt into proof that the kingdom needs harsher leadership. Because the kingdom just witnessed what happens when weakness is mistaken for virtue. Ashborn preached reform and compassion while organizing an invasion. He spoke of progress while trafficking children. He promised a better world while planning mass murder." The Duke's voice remained completely level. "And now he is dead. His allies are dead or captured. His legacy is ashes. That is not a lesson people forget." Seraphine closed her eyes briefly. "You terrify me." "I know, but you also saved us, in the most brutal, efficient way possible. I did what survival required." She opened her eyes again. "And the ledgers? The families trafficking children? What happens to them now that you have emergency powers?" Vaelor's expression finally shifted. "They will be exposed, publicly, before Parliament, and they will face consequences that make Ashborn's death look merciful. Because you can finally move against them without risking civil war. Because the civil war already happened, and I won." He stood slowly, moving to the window overlooking the destroyed courtyard. "Everything I told you was true. Moving against those families 3 months ago would have fractured Parliament and created chaos. But now, Parliament is terrified. The aristocracy is broken. And I have justification to purge corruption in the name of preventing future attacks." He turned back to her. "Sometimes the moral choice requires waiting for the right moment, even if that waiting is agonizing." Seraphine stared at him for a long moment. "You planned this, not the attack, but the response. You have been positioning pieces for years, waiting for something to justify the purge you wanted to conduct." "I have been preparing for every possible scenario," Vaelor corrected, "including scenarios where my enemies provided the excuse I needed to eliminate obstacles permanently. That is horrifying. That is survival." The Duke returned to his chair. "You can hate me for it if you wish. But those children will be freed. Those families will be destroyed, and Ravaryn will be stronger for it." Seraphine processed this. The complexity, the brutal pragmatism, the willingness to orchestrate long-term plans that involved accepting temporary evil in service of permanent solutions. It should have disgusted her. Some part of her wanted it to disgust her, but another part recognized something uncomfortable. Vaelor Blackthorne got results. He was brutal. He was ruthless. He made decisions that would haunt anyone with a functioning conscience. But children would be saved because of those decisions, and every idealistic reform she had ever proposed would have failed to accomplish that. "I hate that you are right," she said quietly. "I am not right. I am effective. There is a difference." "Is there?" Vaelor considered the question. In a perfect world, compassion would be sufficient, kindness would solve problems, good intentions would generate good outcomes. He shook his head slowly. "But we do not live in a perfect world. We live in Ravaryn, and in Ravaryn the choice is not between good and evil, it is between functional evil and catastrophic chaos." "So you chose functional evil." "I chose survival." His gaze locked with hers. "And last night you chose the same thing. You could have run. You could have let me die and positioned yourself as a victim of my tyranny. Parliament would have welcomed you. Ashborn's allies would have protected you. You would have been celebrated as the woman who escaped the monster." Seraphine said nothing. "But you did not run," Vaelor continued softly. "You fought beside me. You killed for me. You took a bullet for me. And when given the choice between moral purity and practical survival, you chose survival." "I chose you," Seraphine corrected. "Not your philosophy. You." The Duke went very still. "Why?" he asked. It was the same question she had asked him hours earlier. Now, in the morning light streaming through cathedral windows, surrounded by the wreckage of a castle that had been destroyed rather than surrendered, Seraphine understood her answer. "Because you see the world as it is," she said, "not as it should be. And because someone who understands darkness is more valuable than someone who only understands light." Vaelor stood, crossed to her bed, knelt beside it so their faces were level. "I'm going to rebuild this castle," he said quietly. "I'm going to consolidate power in ways that will make me even more hated than before. I'm going to implement policies that prioritize function over compassion, and I'm going to do all of it knowing that history will remember me as a tyrant." He took her hand. "But if you stand beside me, I will ensure that history also remembers someone was strong enough to do so, that someone looked at the monster and chose him anyway, that someone understood the difference between cruelty and necessity." Seraphine felt tears sting her eyes for the first time since the attack. "You're asking me to help you build something terrible. I'm asking you to help me build something that survives. Terrible is subjective. Survival is absolute." She should have said no. Should have recognized this as the moment to escape, to return to her family, to write about the experience and warn others about the dangers of seductive power. Instead, she squeezed his hand. "If I do this, I want actual authority, not decorative titles, not symbolic positions, real power to implement reforms that make Ravaryn less brutal, even if we cannot make it kind." Vaelor's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "Negotiating terms with a man who just destroyed his own castle to avoid surrender. You truly do not understand self-preservation." "I understand it perfectly. Which is why I need guaranteed protections before agreeing to stand beside someone this dangerous." The Duke laughed. It was not a pleasant sound, but it was genuine. The Duke. The first authentic laugh Seraphine had heard from him. "Done," he said. "You will have genuine authority over legal reforms, tenant rights, and oversight of noble conduct. But you will operate within frameworks I establish. And you will accept that some decisions require brutality you will not approve. I will fight you on those decisions. I expect nothing less. And if we reach an impasse, then we negotiate, like we are doing now." Vaelor stood, pulling her hand to his lips in a gesture that was more promise than courtesy. "Welcome to the true beginning of your marriage. Lady Seraphine, it will not be easy. It will not be gentle. But I swear it will never be boring." Bam. Seraphine looked up at him, at the man who had burned his kingdom rather than lose her, who had killed with his bare hands to avenge her injury, who offered her power in exchange for complicity in maintaining systems she fundamentally opposed. She should have been horrified. Instead, she felt alive in ways the Royal Academy had never taught her to expect. "One condition," she said, Name it. Never lie to me about who you are. Never pretend to be softer than you are. Never perform compassion you do not feel. Vaelor's eyes locked with hers. And in exchange, I will never pretend to approve of things I hate. Never stop fighting for better options. Never let you forget there is a difference between necessary evil and evil you have simply stopped questioning. Agreed. They stared at each other in the morning light. Two people who should have destroyed each other, discovering that destruction was sometimes the foundation for something stronger than either could build alone. Outside, Ravaryn began the process of recovering from its worst internal attack in 50 years. And inside the cathedral, the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne forged an alliance that would reshape the kingdom in ways neither had planned, but both had chosen. There is one more thing, Vaelor said quietly. What? I would burn this kingdom to ash before I let anyone hurt you again. It was not romantic. It was not soft. It was a threat disguised as devotion, possession, wrapped in protection, obsession given voice. Seraphine understood exactly what it meant. I know, she said simply, and she did not pull away. Because some part of her had already decided that being possessed by someone powerful enough to keep that promise was better than being worshipped by someone too weak to defend anything at all. The cathedral bells began to ring. Not alarm bells, victory bells, announcing to the entire kingdom that Duke Vaelor Blackthorne had survived. That House Blackthorne had prevailed. That Ravaryn belonged to him more completely than ever before. And standing beside him, wounded but alive, was the woman who had chosen to stop fighting the darkness and instead teach it where the light still hid. Whether that made her a hero or a cautionary tale would be debated for generations. But in that moment, as Vaelor's hand tightened around hers and the bells declared their survival to a kingdom that would fear them both, Seraphine discovered she did not care which. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had chosen a man over morality, had accepted that sometimes the only way to change monsters was to stand close enough that they remembered what it meant to protect something. There was no return after that, only forward, into whatever Ravaryn would become when ruled by a tyrant who had found his conscience and a reformer who had learned the value of teeth. 3 weeks after the attack, Parliament convened in the Grand Assembly Hall, not in Blackthorne Keep. The castle remained a construction site, crews working around the clock to rebuild what Vaelor had destroyed. Instead, they gathered in the capital city of Ironhaven, in a building designed specifically to remind everyone that power in Ravaryn ultimately flowed through political structures rather than military dominance. The hall could seat 500. Today it held 473 members of parliament, 12 magistrates, and representatives from every noble house that still possessed enough influence to demand attendance. At the front, elevated on a platform that placed him above everyone else, Duke Vaelor Blackthorne stood beside his wife. He wore black formal attire trimmed with silver. No ornamentation, no crown. He did not need theatrical displays to communicate authority. His presence accomplished that without assistance. Seraphine stood to his right, wearing deep blue that somehow managed to appear both elegant and militaristic. Her wound had healed enough that she could stand without visible pain, though Vaelor knew she still struggled with movement. She had refused to postpone this session, had insisted on being present for what came next, because what came next would reshape Ravaryn permanently. The Lord Chancellor, an ancient politician named Cedric Voss, raised his gavel. The room fell silent with practiced efficiency. This emergency session of Parliament has been called, Voss announced, his voice carrying through the acoustically perfect hall, to address the events of 3 weeks past, the invasion of Blackthorne Keep, the assassination attempt on Duke Blackthorne and Lady Seraphine, the death of Lord Malrek Ashborn and the collapse of the Southern Coalition, and the subsequent discovery of criminal enterprises operating within noble houses. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Duke Blackthorne has invoked emergency powers granted under the crisis protocols of 1847. He will now present evidence requiring immediate parliamentary action. Vaelor stepped forward. He did not carry notes, did not reference documents. He simply began speaking with the absolute certainty of someone who had spent 3 weeks preparing for exactly this moment. Members of Parliament, you all know what happened at Blackthorne Keep. You know that Lord Ashborn led an invasion force designed to execute me and install himself as regent. You know that traitors within my own staff provided access. You know that only immediate and brutal response prevented total catastrophe. His gaze swept across the assembled nobles. What you do not know is why Ashborn believed he could succeed. What convinced a politician to risk everything on a military coup? What made him confident that enough of you would support his actions, that Parliament would legitimize the transition? Uncomfortable shifting rippled through the hall. Uncomfortable shifting. The answer, Vaelor continued quietly, is that Ashborn believed Ravaryn was weak, that my focus on order had created brittleness rather than strength, that removing me would allow progressive forces to reshape the kingdom into something more palatable to those who mistake kindness for competence. He gestured towards Seraphine. My wife shares some of those beliefs. She has made no secret of her disagreement with my methods. She has publicly advocated for reforms I have resisted. And 3 weeks ago, when given the opportunity to abandon me and align with those who promised gentler governance, she chose to fight beside me instead. Seraphine's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. This was not the speech they had discussed. Why? Vaelor asked. Why would someone who opposes my philosophy choose me over ideological allies? The answer reveals something essential about governance that many of you have forgotten. He began walking along the edge of the platform, forcing Parliament members to turn and follow his movement. Lady Seraphine chose survival over sentiment. She recognized that Ashborn's promises were theater designed to exploit weakness. She understood that regardless of how brutal my methods appear, they function, and she accepted the uncomfortable truth that in moments of genuine crisis, functionality matters more than morality. The hall was completely silent now. The hall. I bring this to your attention, Vaelor said, stopping at the center of the platform, because that same choice now faces all of you. In the wake of Ashborn's failed coup, I have uncovered evidence of systematic corruption that extends far beyond the Southern Coalition. Evidence that requires immediate action. He nodded toward the rear doors. They opened. Guards entered carrying 3 bodies on stretchers. Not dead. Alive. Bound and gagged, but conscious. 3 men in expensive clothing that marked them as nobility despite their current circumstances. The hall erupted into shocked murmurs. Lord Henrik Caldwell, Vaelor announced, pointing to the first stretcher. Lord Marcus Thane, Lord Darius Wexford, 3 of the 5 noble houses operating child trafficking networks across Ravaryn for the past 8 years. The murmurs became shouts. During the chaos of Ashborn's attack, Vaelor continued, his voice cutting through the noise, I authorized raids on properties owned by these families. We recovered 243 children from labor camps disguised as training academies. We seized ledgers documenting sales, purchases, and distributions. And we obtained confessions from estate managers detailing exactly how this enterprise operated. He walked to the first stretcher, looking down at Lord Caldwell with an expression that made the bound man shrink away despite being unable to move. These men believed they were untouchable, that their political connections and economic importance made them immune to consequences, that Ravaryn needed them more than it needed justice. Vaelor turned back to Parliament. They were wrong. Seraphine watched this unfold with growing unease. She had known Vaelor planned to expose the trafficking networks. They had discussed strategy extensively during her recovery. But the presentation felt different than what they had agreed upon. More theatrical. More designed to create spectacle rather than build consensus. More like a declaration than a proposal. Under emergency powers, Vaelor said, I am authorizing the immediate seizure of all assets belonging to houses Caldwell, Thane, and Wexford. Their lands will be redistributed to tenant farmers who have demonstrated loyalty. Their wealth will fund victim compensation and institutional reforms. Their titles will be permanently revoked. He paused. And the lords themselves will be executed, publicly, within 48 hours. The hall exploded into chaos. Half the Parliament rose in protest. The other half sat in stunned silence. Lord Chancellor Voss banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order without success. Seraphine moved to Vaelor's side. What are you doing? This was not the plan. The plan changed, he said quietly, not looking at her. You cannot simply execute nobility without trial, without due process. You are not a king, Vaelor. You are a duke bound by parliamentary law. I am a duke operating under emergency powers that supersede standard procedures. Now he looked at her. This is what necessary action looks like, Seraphine. Not proposals, not debates, not months of legal maneuvering while those men prepare defenses and bribe magistrates. Immediate, decisive, permanent. This is tyranny, This is governance. Before Seraphine could respond, Lord Chancellor Voss finally restored enough order to speak. Your Grace, these are serious allegations requiring serious evidence. Parliament cannot simply accept executions without proper judicial review. Vaelor smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Then let us review the evidence, publicly, in excruciating detail. I have documentation spanning 8 years, names of accomplices, testimonies from victims, financial records that implicate dozens of additional noble families in either direct participation or willful ignorance. He let that sink in. We can spend 6 months conducting trials that will expose every corrupt practice in Ravaryn's aristocracy. We can watch this parliament tear itself apart as houses turn on each other to avoid prosecution. We can create the exact chaos and instability that makes kingdoms collapse. Vaelor's voice dropped. Or you can trust that I have verified these charges beyond any doubt, authorize the executions, and allow me to handle this quietly enough that the kingdom survives intact. It was a masterful trap. Either Parliament granted him unprecedented authority, or they triggered investigations that would destroy half the nobility. Seraphine finally understood what Vaelor had done. He had not just exposed the trafficking networks. He had weaponized them, turned criminal enterprises into political leverage that forced Parliament to choose between accepting his power or accepting their own destruction. You planned this, she whispered. The raids during the attack, the timing of this session, all of it designed to give you exactly this moment. I told you I was preparing for every scenario. Vaelor's expression remained neutral, including scenarios where my enemies provided the justification I needed. Oh. You use those children, use their suffering as ammunition for a power grab. I am ending their suffering while simultaneously consolidating authority to prevent future abuses. That is not exploitation. That is efficiency. Seraphine felt something cold settle in her chest. This is not what we agreed to. We agreed you would have authority over reforms within frameworks I established. This is me establishing frameworks. Parliament was voting. Not formally. Not yet. But Seraphine could see the calculation happening across hundreds of faces. Noble houses doing the math, weighing their own potential exposure against the cost of granting Vaelor expanded power, recognizing that resisting would trigger investigations they could not survive. Within 15 minutes, the outcome was obvious. Parliament would cave. Vaelor would win. And Ravaryn would become something fundamentally different than it had been that morning. The vote was called. 347 in favor of granting emergency judicial authority. 89 opposed. 37 abstentions. Lord Chancellor Voss looked like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. The motion passes. Duke Blackthorne is authorized to proceed with executions under emergency powers. May the realm forgive us. Eat. Vaelor nodded once. The executions will occur tomorrow at dawn in Cathedral Square. Attendance is mandatory for all parliamentary members. Ravaryn needs to witness what happens to those who prey on the vulnerable. He turned and walked from the platform. Seraphine followed, her mind racing. They exited through a side corridor that led to private chambers reserved for high nobility. The moment the door closed behind them, she turned on him. You lied to me. Vaelor removed his formal coat with practiced efficiency. I told you exactly what I planned to do. Expose the trafficking networks. Eliminate the families responsible. Use the crisis to implement permanent changes. You did not tell me you were going to leverage children's suffering into an authoritarian power grab. Because that description is inaccurate. I leveraged criminal evidence into necessary authority. The suffering was already occurring. I simply refused to let it be wasted. Seraphine stared at him. Do you hear yourself? You sound like a monster justifying atrocity through bureaucratic language. I sound like someone who understands that power requires decisiveness. You want reforms? You want legal protections for tenants? You want institutional changes that actually function? Vaelor stepped closer. They require authority, real authority, not suggestions that Parliament can ignore when convenient. Actual power to implement policy without requiring consensus from people invested in maintaining corruption. Power you now have because you terrified Parliament into submission. You now have because... Power I now have because I demonstrated that resistance carries consequences. Seraphine felt tears of frustration sting her eyes. This is not what I signed up for. I agreed to stand beside someone brutal but principled, not someone who treats human suffering as strategic resource. The principle is unchanged. Ravaryn's survival requires harsh methods. The only difference is that now I have authority to implement those methods efficiently instead of fighting Parliament every step. The difference, Seraphine said quietly, is that you just crossed a line you can never uncross. You executed justice without trial, seized property without due process, implemented authoritarian control in direct violation of every legal framework Ravaryn was built on. Vaelor's expression hardened. And I saved 243 children while simultaneously preventing future abuses by making an example so brutal that no one will dare attempt similar enterprises for a generation. By becoming exactly what Ashborn accused you of being, a tyrant who uses fear as his only tool. If that is what survival requires, then yes. The simple honesty of that statement broke something inside Seraphine. She had known Vaelor was brutal, had accepted his ruthlessness as necessary evil, had convinced herself that his willingness to make terrible choices came from genuine concern for Ravaryn's stability rather than hunger for control. But watching him manipulate Parliament, seeing him weaponize evidence with surgical precision, recognizing that he had been planning this consolidation of power for months, possibly years, and had simply waited for the right moment, she realized she had been naive. Vaelor Blackthorne was not a reluctant tyrant forced into harsh methods by circumstances beyond his control. He was someone who thrived on control, who needed dominance the way other people needed air, who had built an entire philosophy justifying his hunger for power by framing it as duty. I need time, Seraphine said, moving toward the door. Time to process this. Time to decide if I can live with what you just did. Vaelor did not try to stop her. Take whatever time you need, but understand something, Seraphine. I did not do this to you. I did not betray your trust. I did exactly what I have always done. What I told you I would do: survive, protect Ravaryn, eliminate threats with maximum efficiency. He picked up a document from the nearby table. You chose to interpret that as reluctant pragmatism instead of fundamental nature. That misunderstanding is not my responsibility to fix. Seraphine left without responding. Behind her, Vaelor stood alone in the chamber. For the first time since the attack, genuine emotion crossed his face. Not regret, certainty that he had just lost something irreplaceable, but also recognition that losing it had been inevitable the moment Seraphine truly understood who he was. The executions occurred at dawn, Cathedral Square filled with thousands of spectators. Not just Parliament members, common citizens, merchants, tenant farmers, people from every corner of Ravaryn who had heard that Duke Blackthorne was making an example of corrupt nobility. 3 platforms had been constructed overnight. 3 nooses prepared with mechanical precision. 3 lords who had woken that morning as members of the most powerful families in the kingdom and would die as cautionary tales. Vaelor stood on a raised dais overlooking the square. Seraphine was not beside him. She had remained in her quarters through the night, had refused to attend, had sent word through servants that she was indisposed and would not be participating in public functions until further notice. The court understood what that meant. The Duchess was distancing herself from the Duke's actions. Thrace appeared at Vaelor's shoulder. Your Grace, the magistrates are prepared to proceed. Vaelor nodded. Begin. The 3 lords were brought forward. They did not go quietly. Lord Caldwell screamed about injustice, about parliamentary rights, about how this violated every legal precedent Ravaryn had established. Lord Thane wept openly, begging for mercy. Lord Wexford maintained dignified silence, but his face was gray with terror. The charges were read aloud: child trafficking, slavery, conspiracy to defraud the crown, murder of witnesses. The list went on for 10 minutes, each crime documented with evidence that had been displayed publicly, so no one could claim the accusations were fabricated. Then came the testimonies. Children who had been rescued, parents who had lost sons and daughters, witnesses who had seen the camps. The victims were given voices, and their voices carried more weight than any legal argument could have provided. By the time the testimonies ended, even those who had opposed the executions were silent. The nooses were placed. Vaelor raised his hand. 3 hangmen prepared to release the platforms, and that was when the first arrow struck. Not from the crowd. From a rooftop 200 yards distant, the arrow hit one of the hangmen directly in the throat, dropping him instantly. Before anyone could react, 2 more arrows followed, killing the remaining executioners with precision that indicated professional archery. Chaos erupted. Guards surrounded Vaelor immediately, shields raised. Soldiers poured into the square, searching for the shooter. Citizens screamed and fled, creating a stampede that made organized response impossible. More arrows followed. Not targeting Vaelor, targeting anyone trying to reorganize the executions. Guards, magistrates, anyone approaching the platforms where the 3 lords stood with nooses around their necks, but no one alive to complete the sentences. Thrace grabbed Vaelor's arm. "Your Grace, we need to evacuate you immediately." "No." Vaelor remained fixed in place, his eyes scanning rooftops. "This is coordinated, professional. Someone wants those executions stopped but does not want me dead." Which means whoever hired that archer believes keeping those lords alive serves their interests. The Duke's expression went cold. "Find the source, now!" Soldiers fanned out through the city. 15 minutes later, they found the archer's nest. Empty. The shooter had vanished into the urban maze of Ironhaven with the efficiency of someone who had planned multiple escape routes. But they found something else. A letter. Sealed with wax bearing a symbol Vaelor recognized immediately. The crest of House Vael, Seraphine's family. Vaelor opened the letter with hands that did not shake despite the fury building in his chest. The message was brief. "You have 3 days to release Lords Caldwell, Thane, and Wexford. You have 3 days to revoke the emergency powers Parliament granted. You have 3 days to return Ravaryn to legitimate governance. Or we expose evidence that will destroy not just your reputation, but your wife's as well. Evidence that proves Lady Seraphine has been collaborating with Southern forces since before the attack. Evidence that makes her complicit in everything you claim to oppose. Choose carefully. Duke Blackthorne. Save your power or save your wife. You cannot have both." There was no signature. There did not need to be. Vaelor stood in the square surrounded by chaos, holding proof that someone in Seraphine's own family had just declared war on him using her as leverage. And the truly devastating part was not the threat itself. It was the possibility that the evidence mentioned was real. Because Seraphine had been corresponding with Southern houses before their marriage. She had advocated for progressive reforms that aligned with coalition interests. She had publicly opposed Vaelor's methods in ways that could easily be reframed as coordinated undermining. If someone wanted to destroy her, they had materials to work with. Thrace read the letter over Vaelor's shoulder. "Your Grace, this is obviously true," Vaelor interrupted quietly, "or true enough that proving otherwise will be impossible. You cannot seriously believe Lady Seraphine was involved in Ashborn's conspiracy. Well, what I believe is irrelevant. What I can prove matters. And if House Vael has assembled evidence that appears damning, then public opinion will turn against her regardless of actual guilt." The Duke looked at the platforms where 3 lords still stood with nooses around their necks, their executions interrupted by forces he had not anticipated. He had consolidated power, eliminated enemies, positioned himself as the strongest authority Ravaryn had seen in decades, and in doing so, he had created a target large enough that even his wife's own family was willing to sacrifice her to bring him down. "What are your orders?" Thrace asked quietly. Vaelor stood silent for a long moment. Then he folded the letter and placed it inside his coat. "Postpone the executions. Place the lords under maximum security. And send word to Lady Seraphine that I require her presence immediately." "Your Grace." "Now, Thrace." The advisor departed. Vaelor remained in the square, watching workers clean up the chaos, feeling something he had not felt in a decade. Genuine fear. Not for himself, not for his power, not for his legacy. For the possibility that the one person who had chosen to stand beside him was about to be destroyed because of that choice. And for the first time since becoming Duke of Ravaryn, Vaelor Blackthorne did not have a plan that guaranteed he could prevent it. Seraphine arrived at the private study within the hour. She entered to find Vaelor standing at the window, his back to the door. He did not turn when she entered, did not speak, just stood motionless, radiating tension that filled the room like smoke.
"You summoned me," Seraphine said carefully. The executions were interrupted. Vaelor's voice was completely flat. "Professional archer, killed 3 hangmen, prevented completion of the sentences."
"And you think I was involved?" Now he turned. "Were you?" The question hit like a physical blow. Seraphine stared at him. "You are asking me if I hired an assassin to undermine your authority, if I coordinated with enemies to stop executions I opposed, if I betrayed you. I am asking if you had any contact with your family in the past 3 weeks, any correspondence, any messages, anything that could be interpreted as coordination." "Why?" Vaelor pulled the letter from his coat and handed it to her. Seraphine read it once, then again. Her face went pale. "This is a lie," she said quietly. "I've had no contact with House Vael since arriving in Ravaryn, no correspondence with Southern forces, no collaboration of any kind. Can you prove that? Can I prove a negative? Can I prove I did not do something?" Her voice rose. "How exactly does one demonstrate the absence of conspiracy, Vaelor? By showing me every letter you have sent, every message you have received, every conversation you have had with anyone outside Blackthorne Keep." Seraphine threw the letter onto the desk. "You want to interrogate me, to treat me like a suspect, to assume guilt and demand I prove innocence. I want to protect you." The words came out louder than Vaelor intended. "Someone is using you as leverage against me. They have evidence, real or fabricated, that will destroy your reputation. And I need to know if any of that evidence has basis in reality so I can prepare an actual defense instead of walking blind into a trap." "The defense," Seraphine said coldly, "is that you trust me, that you look at everything we have been through and recognize that I would never betray you to people whose values I have publicly rejected. Trust is not a legal argument. Trust does not counter evidence presented before Parliament. Trust will not save you when House Vael produces documents with your signature coordinating with Ashborn's coalition." "Then what will save me? Tell me, Your Grace. What strategy do you have for defending someone you apparently believe might be guilty?" Vaelor's jaw tightened. "I do not believe you are guilty, Lors, but I need to prepare for the possibility that others will. That is not suspicion. That is pragmatism." "It is paranoia." Seraphine moved closer. "You are so convinced that everyone operates through manipulation and betrayal that you cannot conceive of simple loyalty. You see conspiracy everywhere because you are a conspirator. You assume others weaponize relationships because that is how you function. I assume others pursue their interests rationally, and your interests have never aligned with mine." The words hung in the air like poison. Seraphine absorbed them slowly. "You believe that. You genuinely believe I have been tolerating you while waiting for opportunities to undermine your authority. I believe you are an idealist trapped in a political marriage to someone whose methods disgust you. I believe you have maintained surface cooperation while fundamentally opposing everything I represent. And I believe that if House Vael offered you an exit, you would take it." "Then you do not know me at all." "Perhaps not." Vaelor's voice dropped. "Or perhaps I know you better than you know yourself. Perhaps I understand that standing beside me has cost you pieces of your soul you can never recover, that every compromise you have made eats at you, that given the choice between me and your principles, you will eventually choose principles." Seraphine felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. "I took a bullet for you. I fought beside you when I could have run. I chose you over ideological allies and moral comfort. And you think all of that was performance?" "I think all of that was instinct. Survival responses in moments of crisis. But we are not in crisis now. We are in the slow calculation of whether the cost of standing beside me is worth the benefits." He moved to the desk, pulling out another document. "This is a draft statement. It declares that our marriage was politically arranged without emotional attachment, that you were coerced into supporting my actions during the attack, that you have since reconsidered your position and wish to distance yourself from my governance." Vaelor set it in front of her. "Sign this. Return to House Vael. Let them use you as evidence that even my own wife recognized my tyranny. It will damage my reputation but protect you when the accusations come. Seraphine looked at the document, then at Vaelor. You are asking me to leave. I'm offering you escape before the trap closes. By confirming every suspicion that I was never actually loyal, by giving your enemies exactly what they want, by saving your life and reputation at the cost of mine. His expression was completely controlled. That is what you wanted, is it not? Someone strong enough to protect you? Consider this protection. Leave now, publicly, with justification, before House Vael can paint you as a co-conspirator. Seraphine understood what he was doing. Vaelor was giving her an exit, constructing a narrative where she escaped with honor while he absorbed the political damage, sacrificing his own position to ensure she survived what came next. It was the most selfless thing she had ever seen him do. It was also complete manipulation, because if she signed that document, she confirmed his worldview, proved that loyalty was transactional, demonstrated that even she, who had claimed to see past the monster to the man, would abandon him when costs exceeded benefits. This is a test, she said quietly. This is a choice. Same thing. Seraphine picked up the document, read it thoroughly, set it back down. You wrote this knowing I would refuse, knowing that offering me escape would force me to either accept, confirming your cynicism, or reject, binding me closer to you. Vaelor said nothing. Which outcome do you actually want? Seraphine asked. Do you want me to leave, to be safe and distant? Or do you want me to stay, proving that someone can choose you despite understanding exactly who you are? I want you to survive. That is not an answer. It is the only answer I have. They stood facing each other across the desk, the unsigned document between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. If I stay, Seraphine said slowly, House Vael will release their evidence. Parliament will call investigations. My reputation will be destroyed along with yours. Yes, but if I leave, you lose the only person who has ever challenged your methods while choosing to stand beside you anyway. Yes, so either we both fall or I abandon you to fall alone. Vaelor's control finally cracked. I do not want you to fall. That is the point. I am offering you a way out before the consequences of my actions destroy you along with everything else. And what if I do not want out? Then you are a fool, because House Vael has 3 days, and I do not have a strategy that saves both of us. Seraphine moved around the desk, stood directly in front of him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, close enough to recognize that beneath the cold calculation, he was terrified of losing her. Then we have 3 days to find one, she said quietly. There is always a strategy. You taught me that. Every problem has a solution if you are willing to pay the cost. She placed her hand over his. What cost are you willing to pay, Vaelor? He stared at her. What are you asking? I'm asking if you are willing to give up the power you just consolidated, the emergency authority, the control you have spent decades building, everything you sacrificed to maintain. Understanding dawned in his eyes. You want me to negotiate with House Vael, to surrender political ground in exchange for their silence. I want you to choose what matters most, your power or your wife, because you were right about one thing. You cannot have both. It was the same ultimatum House Vael had delivered, but coming from Seraphine, it meant something different. She was not demanding he choose her out of obligation or fear. She was testing whether he had learned anything from watching his kingdom burn, whether he could recognize that some things were worth more than control, whether the man who had destroyed his own castle rather than lose her would make the same choice when the stakes were his legacy instead of stone walls. Vaelor pulled away from her touch, turned back to the window, stood silent for a long moment. If I surrender the emergency powers, he said quietly, Parliament will revert to its previous dysfunction. The reforms we planned will stall. The trafficking networks we exposed will find new protections. Everything I accomplished will erode within months, probably. Ravaryn will be weaker, more vulnerable, more corrupt, possibly. And you will be safe, your reputation intact, your future secured. Definitely. Vaelor's reflection in the glass showed nothing, but Seraphine saw his hands curl into fists. I told you I would burn this kingdom to ash before I let anyone take you from me, he said. I remember. I meant it. I know. He turned to face her fully. But burning kingdoms is easy. Kingdoms are stone and politics and abstractions. This is different. This is choosing between everything I have built and the one person who chose to stand beside me while I built it. Vaelor moved closer. If I give up power to save you, I become the weakness I have spent my life eliminating. I prove that emotions matter more than strategy. That sentiment trumps survival. Everything I have told myself about necessary brutality becomes a lie. Or, Seraphine said softly, you prove that strength includes knowing when to yield. That true power means choosing what you protect instead of just protecting everything. That maybe, possibly, the most dangerous man in Ravaryn is capable of growth. I do not want growth. I want certainty. Then sign your own document. Send me away. Maintain your power and your philosophy intact. Prove that you were right all along about loyalty being transactional. She stepped back. Or admit that I changed something in you. That watching your castle burn taught you there are things worth more than control. That maybe the tyrant is tired of being a tyrant. Vaelor stared at her with an expression she could not quite read. Then he walked to his desk, picked up the document he had drafted, and slowly, deliberately, tore it in half. I will negotiate with House Vael, he said quietly. I will surrender the emergency powers. I will accept weaker political position in exchange for their silence regarding you. Relief flooded through Seraphine. Thank you. But understand something. Vaelor's voice was very cold. I am not doing this because I learned growth or virtue or any other comfortable fiction. I am doing this because I ran the mathematics and determined that keeping you is worth more than keeping power. He moved closer, which means you now owe me everything. Your loyalty, your support, your absolute cooperation with whatever I require to rebuild what I am sacrificing. I am choosing you over my kingdom. You will spend the rest of your life earning that choice. It was not romantic. It was a transaction, an exchange, power for possession framed as devotion. But it was also Vaelor Blackthorne admitting she mattered more than his legacy. And that admission, wrapped in all its manipulative packaging, was the most honest thing he had ever said. Agreed, Seraphine said. No negotiations, no debates. When I tell you something is necessary, you trust that I am correct. Within reason, there is no reason, only necessity. Then we are going to have problems. Despite everything, Vaelor almost smiled. We have always had problems. That is why this works. He pulled her close, not gently, not carefully, with the possessive intensity of someone who had just committed to keeping something regardless of cost. I'm going to hate being weaker, he said against her hair. I'm going to resent every compromise, every concession, every moment where I lack authority to simply eliminate problems. I know, and I am going to blame you for it. I know that too. Good. He pulled back enough to look at her face. As long as we are both clear that this is your fault, my fault that you chose me over tyranny, my fault would imply I had a choice. You made yourself indispensable. That is manipulation, Seraphine. You are just as calculating as I am. She smiled. It was the first genuine smile since the execution attempt. I learned from the best. That is deeply concerning. It should be. They stood together in the study, both understanding that the next 3 days would reshape their lives permanently. Vaelor would contact House Vael, would negotiate terms, would surrender the power he had spent 3 weeks consolidating in exchange for protection for his wife, and Seraphine would stand beside him through whatever came next, not because she approved of his methods, not because she had forgiven his manipulation, but because she had chosen him. And she was discovering that choosing someone meant accepting all the terrible, complicated, ruthless parts of them. That love was not finding someone perfect. It was finding someone whose damage aligned with yours in ways that created something stronger than either person alone. Outside the study, Ravaryn continued turning. Inside, two people who should have destroyed each other discovered that sometimes the most dangerous alliances were the ones where both parties understood exactly how dangerous they were and refused to care. The message arrived at dawn on the second day, not through official channels, not delivered by diplomatic courier. A street child handed it directly to Seraphine while she walked through the market district of Ironhaven, accompanied by 2 guards who had been explicitly ordered to let her move freely. The boy disappeared into the crowd before anyone could question him. Seraphine opened the sealed letter, standing in the middle of the marketplace, surrounded by vendors hawking vegetables and merchants negotiating prices. Normal life, continuing while her world teetered on the edge of collapse. The handwriting was familiar. Her brother's. Meet me at the Old Harbor Warehouse District. Sunset. Come alone or do not come at all. This is your last chance to choose family over the monster you married. No signature, no crest, just the implicit threat wrapped in the language of concern that her family had perfected over generations. Seraphine folded the letter carefully and continued walking. The guards followed at a respectful distance, unaware that she had just received an ultimatum disguised as an invitation. Unaware that House Vael was moving faster than Vaelor had anticipated. Unaware that the 3-day deadline had just been shortened to hours. She should have gone directly to Vaelor, should have shown him the letter and let him handle the tactical response. That was the logical choice, the strategic choice, the choice someone who trusted her partner would make. Instead, Seraphine found herself calculating. If she told Vaelor, he would lock her in protective custody and send soldiers to the warehouse. There would be violence. Deaths. House Vael would respond by releasing whatever evidence they possessed, and the political firestorm would consume both of them. But if she went alone, she might be able to negotiate directly with her family, might be able to understand what they actually wanted beyond destroying Vaelor, might be able to find a solution that did not involve choosing between husband and blood. It was a terrible plan. She knew it was a terrible plan even as she began implementing it, but some part of her needed to face her family directly. Needed to understand why they were willing to sacrifice her to bring down a man they had never met. Needed to hear from their own mouths what they thought justified this betrayal. So when sunset approached, Seraphine told her guard she was retiring early due to headache. She locked her chamber door from the inside. And then she climbed out the window using a route she had discovered during her first week in Ironhaven, back when being able to escape had seemed like necessary contingency planning. The Old Harbor District was exactly what its name suggested. Abandoned warehouses that had once serviced Ravaryn's maritime trade before the ports shifted south. Empty buildings with broken windows. Streets where even criminals walked carefully. The kind of place where bodies disappeared and questions went unasked. Perfect location for a conversation no one wanted witnessed. Seraphine arrived as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. She wore dark clothing, carried a knife stolen from the kitchens. Knew absolutely that she was walking into a trap, but walked anyway because turning back meant accepting she was too afraid to face her own family. The warehouse her brother had specified stood at the end of a collapsed pier. 3 stories. Mostly intact. Light visible through gaps in the boarded windows. She pushed through the rusted door. Inside, the warehouse was nearly empty except for rotting cargo crates and the smell of seawater mixed with decay. Footsteps echoed on the wooden floor above. Voices carried through the hollow structure. Seraphine climbed the stairs to the 2nd level. Her brother waited there. Lord Adrian Vael looked exactly as she remembered. Mid-30s. Sharp features that resembled hers enough to be unsettling. Expensive clothing that somehow managed to appear casual despite costing more than most people earned in a year. The kind of aristocrat who had never questioned whether his privilege was earned. He was not alone. 8 armed men surrounded him. Professional guards wearing House Vael colors. Men who looked at Seraphine with the cold assessment of people evaluating a target rather than protecting a family member. Adrian smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Little sister, I was not certain you would come. You gave me little choice. Seraphine stopped 10 feet away, her hand resting casually near the knife hidden in her belt. What do you want, Adrian? Well, Mikey ites. What I have always wanted. What our family wants. For you to stop embarrassing us by standing beside a tyrant everyone in the kingdom recognizes as a monster. Vaelor is many things. Monster is subjective. He executed nobility without trial, seized property through intimidation, consolidated authoritarian power in direct violation of parliamentary law. Adrian's voice remained pleasant, conversational. Those are not subjective assessments. Those are documented facts that make you complicit in tyranny simply by remaining his wife. Seraphine studied her brother's face, looking for genuine concern, finding only calculated ambition wrapped in fraternal language.
"This is not about protecting me," she said quietly. "This is about using me as leverage against someone you fear. Fear is too strong a word. Concerned would be more accurate."
Adrian gestured to one of the guards, who produced a leather folder. "We have been monitoring your situation since you married Duke Blackthorne. Correspondence, meeting records, financial transactions, all documenting your involvement in his increasingly authoritarian governance." He opened the folder, displaying pages covered in text and signatures. "Your name appears on policy proposals that restrict noble rights, on financial audits that targeted Southern families, on security briefings that preceded Ashborn's assassination." Adrian looked up. "Individually, these could be explained as dutiful participation. Together, they paint a picture of active collaboration with a tyrant." Seraphine's stomach went cold. "Those documents are real." "Of course they are real. We did not need to fabricate evidence, sister. You provided it yourself by choosing to actually participate in Blackthorne's governance instead of remaining a decorative wife. So you are punishing me for having opinions, for trying to implement reforms from within the system. We are giving you an exit before your good intentions are weaponized against you." Adrian closed the folder. "Come home. Publicly renounce Blackthorne. Claim you were coerced into supporting his actions. House Vael will protect you from retaliation, and Parliament will use your testimony to remove him from power." And if I refuse? Then tomorrow morning, these documents reach every member of Parliament. By noon, you will be under investigation for conspiracy to undermine democratic institutions. By evening, you will be arrested alongside your husband. Adrian's expression remained pleasant. "We would prefer not to take that path, but we will not allow the Vael name to be associated with Ravaryn's descent into dictatorship." Seraphine absorbed this slowly. "You are threatening to destroy me unless I betray Vaelor. We are offering you escape from consequences of choices you made under duress." "I was not under duress. I chose him, knowingly, after understanding exactly who he is." Adrian's pleasant expression finally cracked. "Then you are a fool. Blackthorne is using you. He married you for political alliances and keeps you compliant through manipulation. The moment you become more liability than asset, he will discard you the same way he discarded his first wife. His first wife threw herself from a tower because she could not handle the reality of who he was. I am still here because I can." "You think that makes you strong?" Her brother laughed. "It makes you delusional. You have convinced yourself that standing beside a monster is noble, that your presence somehow mitigates his brutality, that love can reform someone fundamentally broken." He stepped closer. "But Vaelor Blackthorne is not broken, Seraphine. He is exactly what he was designed to be, a weapon shaped by generations of violent men who believed power justified any action. And you cannot fix weapons. You can only be cut by them." Seraphine met his gaze steadily. "I'm not trying to fix him. I'm trying to stand beside someone strong enough to survive what you and every other ambitious lord cannot. Someone who understands that real power means making choices that haunt you. Choices like executing people without trial. Choices like eliminating child traffickers everyone else was willing to tolerate for political convenience." Adrian's expression hardened. "Those men deserved judicial process, not theatrical execution designed to intimidate Parliament. Those men deserved what they got. The process was Vaelor showing restraint by killing them quickly instead of slowly. Listen to yourself. You are defending murder, justifying authoritarianism, becoming exactly the kind of enabler that allows tyrants to thrive. I am accepting reality instead of hiding behind legal fiction that protects predators." They stood facing each other in the empty warehouse, their voices echoing off walls that had witnessed decades of different conversations, but probably never one this poisonous between siblings. "Last chance," Adrian said quietly. "Come with us now, voluntarily, or we release the documents and you face consequences alongside Blackthorne. And if I tell Vaelor about this meeting, if he responds to your threats with violence, then House Vael has prepared for that contingency as well." Her brother gestured toward the windows. Seraphine moved closer, looking out across the harbor district. Her blood went cold. The streets were filled with soldiers, not House Vael guards, professional mercenaries wearing coalition colors, hundreds of them positioned throughout the district in formations designed for urban combat. "We did not come unprepared, Adrian said. "If Blackthorne sends forces against us, we trigger a military response that makes Ashborn's invasion look like amateur hour. The Southern Coalition may have lost its figurehead, but the infrastructure remains, and many houses are very interested in removing a duke who threatens their privileges." Seraphine understood instantly. This was not just blackmail. This was the opening move of another coup attempt. House Vael had allied with remnants of Ashborn's coalition, using her as the excuse to trigger violence that would either force Vaelor to surrender power or destroy him in combat. "You used me as bait," she said slowly. "You knew I would come alone. Knew Vaelor would eventually realize I was missing. Knew he would come looking for me with whatever forces he could mobilize quickly. And when he arrives," Adrian confirmed, "he will find himself outnumbered 10-1 in hostile territory. We will offer him the same choice we offered you: surrender and live, resist and die. He will not surrender. Then he dies, and you become a widow who can testify that your late husband's brutality left you no choice but to seek protection from your family." Her brother moved closer. "Either way, Ravaryn gets legitimate governance again. The only variable is whether you survive the transition." Seraphine felt rage building in her chest. The cold, controlled fury that came from recognizing betrayal was inevitable, and still feeling shocked when it arrived. "You would kill me," she said flatly. "Your own sister, if I refused to cooperate. We would accept your death as regrettable collateral damage in service of removing a tyrant." Adrian's voice carried genuine sorrow beneath the calculation. "I do not want that outcome, but I will not sacrifice the kingdom to save one woman, even if that woman is family." It was the same logic Vaelor used, the same brutal pragmatism, the same willingness to accept terrible costs in service of larger goals, which meant her brother was not fundamentally different from her husband. He simply dressed his ruthlessness in prettier language. "You once told me," Seraphine said quietly, "that family meant protecting each other regardless of politics, that blood mattered more than power. I meant it, but you chose to become something other than family when you married Blackthorne and embraced his methods. I embrace survival, same as you are doing now. The difference is that my survival serves justice. Yours serves a man who will be remembered as one of history's villains." Seraphine laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You actually believe that? You genuinely think you are the virtuous one in this scenario? I am the one trying to save you. Sat. You are the one trying to use me. There is a difference, Adrian, and the fact you cannot see it proves you would be exactly as brutal as Vaelor if given his power. You just lack his honesty about what you are." Her brother's expression went cold. "Then you have made your choice." "I made my choice weeks ago. You just refused to accept it." Adrian nodded to his guards. "Detain her, carefully. She is still family, even if she has forgotten what that means." The guards moved forward. Seraphine drew the kitchen knife. It was a pathetic weapon against 8 armed men. She knew it was pathetic. Drew it anyway because going quietly meant accepting she was a piece to be moved rather than a player in her own right. "Do not," she said quietly, "make the mistake of thinking I'm helpless just because I'm outnumbered." One guard smiled. "Lady Vael, we have orders not to harm you unnecessarily. Please do not make this difficult." "Everything," Seraphine said, "is difficult. That is the point." She attacked, not strategically, not with any real chance of victory, but with the desperate fury of someone who had spent 2 months watching powerful men make decisions about her life without her input and had finally reached the limit of tolerance. The first guard blocked her knife easily and tried to grab her wrist. Seraphine twisted, drove her knee into his groin, used his doubled-over body as a shield against the second guard's attempt to tackle her. It bought her approximately 4 seconds before superior numbers overwhelmed pure rage. They took her down hard, not gently, not with the careful restraint of men handling delicate family members, with the efficient brutality of professionals who recognized she was genuinely trying to hurt them and responded accordingly. Seraphine hit the floor face first, tasted blood. felt her arms wrenched behind her back and tied with rope that cut into her wrists. "Secure her in the back room," Adrian ordered, "and send word to the forward positions. When Blackthorne arrives, we want him to see her immediately. Let him understand what he is fighting for before we give him the choice." They dragged Seraphine through the warehouse. She did not make it easy, fought every step, forced them to physically carry her, made certain that if she was going to be used as bait, at least everyone involved would remember she had not gone quietly. The back room was a storage space with a single window facing the harbor. They tied her to a support column, triple-checked the knots, left 2 guards watching her while the rest returned to the main floor. Seraphine tested the ropes immediately. They held firm. Professional bindings designed to prevent escape without causing permanent damage. She could breathe, could move slightly, could do absolutely nothing useful. Outside the window, the sun finished setting. Darkness covered the harbor district like a blanket designed to hide violence. Somewhere in the streets below, coalition forces waited for Vaelor to arrive. And he would arrive. Seraphine knew that with absolute certainty. Because Vaelor Blackthorne did not abandon assets, did not accept losing pieces from his board. And despite all his talk about transactional relationships and strategic calculations, he had proven during the attack on Blackthorne Keep that she had become something more fundamental than an asset. She had become the thing he protected regardless of cost, which meant he was walking into a trap specifically designed to exploit that weakness. One of the guards watching her was young, maybe 20. He kept glancing at her nervously, as if uncertain how to handle a bound noblewoman who had just tried to stab his colleagues. "You do not have to do this," Seraphine said quietly. The guard did not respond. "They are using me to start a war. You understand that, right? Your commanders are planning to trigger violence that will kill hundreds just to remove one man from power." "Duke Blackthorne is a tyrant," the young guard said. "Removing him serves the kingdom. Duke Blackthorne executed child traffickers. Your commanders are allied with people who tolerated those same traffickers for political convenience. Tell me which side actually serves the kingdom, sir." The guard shifted uncomfortably, but did not reply. Seraphine changed tactics. "What is your name?" "Marcus." "Marcus, do you have family?" "A sister, younger." "Do you have—" "Then you understand why I cannot just accept being used as leverage against someone I chose to marry. Why I would rather fight and lose than cooperate with people who threaten me into betrayal." Marcus looked at her directly for the first time. "Lady Vael, I have orders. That is all that matters. Orders matter when they are ethical. These are not. You are helping ambitious lords trigger violence for political gain. That is not duty. That is complicity." "With respect, my lady, you chose to marry the most hated man in Ravaryn. That was your decision. Facing consequences is not unfair." Seraphine absorbed that. "You are right. I did choose him, knowing exactly who he was. And I would make the same choice again. Because sometimes the most dangerous option is also the most honest." Before Marcus could respond, shouts erupted from below. Vaelor had arrived. The young guard moved to the window, looking down at the street. His expression went pale. "What is it?" Seraphine demanded. "He came alone." "What?" "Duke Blackthorne. He came alone. No soldiers, no guards, just him." Seraphine's heart seized. That is not possible. Vaelor does not take unnecessary risks. But even as she said it, she knew why he had come alone. Because bringing soldiers would trigger the military response House Vael had prepared, would turn this into open warfare where she would likely die in the crossfire. Vaelor had calculated that his only chance of extracting her safely was to present himself as a target too valuable to kill immediately, to offer himself in exchange for her. It was the most strategically insane decision she had ever witnessed him make. It was also the most human. "I need to get down there," Seraphine said urgently. "Marcus, please. Whatever you think of Blackthorne, I am begging you. Untie me before this turns into a massacre." The guard hesitated. His hand moved towards his belt knife, then stopped. "I cannot," he said quietly. "I am sorry." Below, voices rose. Not shouting. Controlled conversation that was somehow more terrifying than violence. Negotiation happening between men who all understood the stakes but disagreed fundamentally about outcomes. Seraphine pulled against the ropes hard enough that blood ran down her wrists. The pain was sharp and immediate and completely irrelevant compared to the need to reach Vaelor before her family made the mistake of believing he was actually surrendering. Because Vaelor Blackthorne did not surrender. He adapted. He calculated. He found angles everyone else missed. And right now, walking alone into enemy territory to negotiate for his wife's release, he was doing something no one expected. He was showing everyone watching that some things mattered more than strategy. That the Duke, who had spent a decade being feared for his ruthlessness, was willing to risk everything for one person. It was vulnerability disguised as strength. Proof of attachment dressed as tactical sacrifice. And it was going to get him killed unless Seraphine found a way to change the equation. She looked at Marcus, at the young guard who had a sister and therefore understood family obligation, at someone who had probably never questioned whether following orders was the same as doing right. "If you let me die here," she said quietly, "you will spend the rest of your life knowing you helped ambitious men murder a woman whose only crime was choosing the wrong husband. Is that something you can live with, Marcus?" The guard's hand moved to his knife again, and this time he pulled it free. "I'm going to regret this," he muttered, moving behind her to cut the ropes. "My commanding officer is going to have me executed. Your commanding officer is going to be too busy dealing with whatever Vaelor does next to worry about one guard." The ropes fell away. Seraphine stood, rubbing circulation back into her wrists. "Thank you. Do not thank me. Just try not to get killed. I would prefer my decision not to be completely pointless. No promises." Seraphine moved to the door. The second guard was still outside, unaware his partner had just committed treason. She hit him from behind with a piece of broken wood, dropping him before he could shout warning. Then she ran, down the stairs, through the warehouse, toward voices that had gone dangerously quiet in the way that preceded violence rather than followed it. She burst through the main entrance into the street and stopped. Vaelor stood in the center of the road, surrounded by 200 coalition soldiers. Archers lined rooftops. Cavalry blocked escape routes. Infantry formations covered every direction. The entire harbor district had become a killing box specifically designed to ensure no one inside survived if orders were given. Her brother stood 10 paces from Vaelor, close enough to negotiate, but far enough to avoid immediate attack. They both turned when Seraphine appeared. Adrian's expression went from shock to fury in the span of a heartbeat. "How did you... Your guards are more ethical than you are." Seraphine walked forward slowly, hands raised to show she was unarmed. "Call this off, Adrian, now, before you trigger something that destroys us all. The only thing being destroyed tonight is Blackthorne's hold on power." Her brother gestured, and soldiers raised weapons. "You had your chance to leave peacefully. You chose to stand beside a tyrant, accept consequences." Vaelor had not moved since Seraphine appeared, had not spoken, had simply watched her with an expression that contained more emotion than she had ever seen him display publicly, relief that she was alive, fury that she had been used as bait, and beneath both, something that looked dangerously close to genuine fear. "Seraphine," he said quietly, "get behind me." Not a chance. She moved to his side, stood close enough that their shoulders touched. "We face this together or not at all. That is tactically insane. If they attack, you die." "Then we die. But I am not watching you sacrifice yourself because my family decided playing politics was worth more than my life." Adrian laughed. How touching. The tyrant and his enabler choosing mutual destruction over sense. This will make excellent propaganda when we explain why we had no choice but to eliminate both of you. Propaganda, Vaelor repeated softly. "You are planning to kill us and frame it as necessary violence. Paint yourselves as heroes removing a threat. Use our deaths to justify seizing power you have not earned." We are removing a tyrant who has terrorized Ravaryn for a decade. The framing writes itself. Then you have fundamentally misunderstood what happens next. Vaelor's voice remained completely calm. You believe superior numbers guarantee victory, that surrounding us with soldiers means we have no options. That intimidation translates to control. He took one step forward. But intimidation only works on people afraid to die. And I stopped being afraid of death the moment I decided some things were worth dying for. Adrian's smile faded. You're bluffing. You always bluff. That is your entire strategy. Make people believe you are willing to do insane things and hope they back down first. Then call my bluff. Vaelor spread his arms. Give the order. Have your archers fire. Kill us both right here in the street. And then explain to Parliament why you needed 200 soldiers to murder an unarmed couple. Silence fell across the harbor district. Everyone understood what was happening. Vaelor had just turned tactical disadvantage into political trap. Because if House Vale killed them now, without provocation, without visible threat, they would confirm every accusation about being power-hungry conspirators. They would lose the moral high ground necessary to legitimize regime change. But if they did not kill them, if they let Vaelor and Seraphine walk away, they proved the Duke was stronger than their combined forces. You think you are clever, Adrian said. But we prepared for this too. We have documents, evidence, testimony that proves you are a danger to the kingdom regardless of whether you appear unarmed tonight. Then produce your evidence. Take it to Parliament. Let democratic process determine guilt. Vaelor's expression did not change. Unless you are afraid that in fair proceedings, your case collapses. That actual investigation reveals your corruption matches or exceeds mine. That the only way you win is through extrajudicial violence disguised as necessary action. He stepped closer, which would make you exactly what you claim I am, a tyrant using force to eliminate opposition. Adrian's face flushed. I am nothing like you. You're exactly like me. The only difference is that I am honest about what I am. You hide behind nobility and virtue while doing the same brutal calculus, the same willingness to sacrifice pieces for victory, the same fundamental belief that power justifies methods. Vaelor was now within arm's reach of Adrian. 200 weapons tracked his movement, but no one fired because no one had been given orders. And everyone understood that firing without orders would create chaos no one could control. The difference between us, Vaelor continued quietly, is that I have spent 10 years accepting the cost of my choices. You're about to learn that cost tonight. Because if you pull that trigger, if you give the order to fire, you will win this battle and lose everything that matters. Your reputation, your legitimacy, your ability to rule anything. He leaned closer. But if you let us leave, you prove you are never strong enough to do what you claimed was necessary. That when faced with actual choice, instead of theoreticals, you lacked the stomach for violence. Adrian's hand moved to his sword. You are trying to manipulate me. I am giving you the same choice you gave my wife. Surrender or face consequences. The only question is whether you have the courage to make hard decisions or just the arrogance to demand others make them. Seraphine watched this unfold with growing understanding. Vaelor was not negotiating. He was forcing her brother to either commit fully to violence or reveal himself as someone who threatened more than he delivered, creating a situation where Adrian had to choose between becoming exactly what he claimed to oppose or accepting defeat. It was manipulation at its purest. Psychology weaponized into strategy. And it was working. Adrian's hand dropped from his sword. Stand down, he ordered his forces. Soldiers hesitated, confused by the reversal, uncertain whether orders were genuine or coerced. I said, stand down! Adrian's voice cracked. Lower your weapons! Slowly, reluctantly, the coalition forces obeyed. Vaelor turned to Seraphine. We are leaving. Now! They walked forward together, through the corridor of soldiers, past cavalry that could have trampled them, under archers who could have ended them with a single volley. No one moved. No one fired. The entire district held its breath while the Duke and Duchess of Ravaryn simply walked away from overwhelming force through nothing but psychological dominance. They reached the edge of the district. Behind them, Adrian stood motionless, his face gray with fury and shame at being outmaneuvered by the man he had come to destroy. This is not over, Blackthorne, he shouted. Vaelor did not turn, did not respond, just kept walking with Seraphine beside him. They disappeared into the darkness beyond the harbor district. And only when they were completely out of sight did Vaelor finally stop. He turned to Seraphine, grabbed her shoulders, pulled her close enough that their foreheads touched. You came alone. Shh, she whispered. You went alone first. That was stupid. Agreed. Your turn to explain why. Seraphine met his eyes. Because I needed to understand if my family actually cared about me or just saw me as a political tool. I needed to hear them admit they would sacrifice me to destroy you. And they admitted it. Which means I was right to choose you over them. You are brutal. You are ruthless. You make terrible decisions. But you have never pretended to value me while actually valuing what I represented. Vaelor's hands tightened on her shoulders. I came to trade myself for you. That was the plan. Surrender to your brother in exchange for your freedom. That is the worst plan you have ever had. I'm aware. But mathematics failed me. Strategy failed me. So I tried something I have not attempted in 10 years. What? Trusting that someone was worth more than survival. But Seraphine felt tears she had been holding back finally fall. We are both terrible at this. At caring about each other. At making decisions that are not either completely cold or completely insane.
Probably. Vaelor pulled her fully against him. But we are alive. Together. Which means we won. For now, Adrian will not stop. House Vael will not stop.
They will find other ways to destroy us.
Then we destroy them first. His voice went cold. They threatened you, used you as bait, tried to force you into betrayal. That is not something I forgive or forget.
Seraphine pulled back enough to see his face. What are you planning? War. Vaelor's expression was absolutely certain. Not military war, political war, economic war, social war. I am going to dismantle House Vael piece by piece until your brother understands that threatening you was the biggest mistake of his life. That will trigger exactly the instability you were trying to avoid. I do not care. They crossed a line, and I am done trying to maintain stability with people who mistake restraint for weakness. He started walking again, pulling her along. Starting tomorrow, we stop playing defensive. We stop reacting to threats. We start eliminating everyone who believes they can use you against me. And we do it so thoroughly that no one ever makes that mistake again. Seraphine should have argued, should have pointed out that aggressive retaliation would confirm every accusation about tyranny, should have reminded him that revenge was not the same as justice. Instead, she found herself nodding. How do we start? We start, Vaelor said quietly, by accepting that neither of us is innocent anymore, that we have both made choices that stained us, that trying to be better people is less important than being strong enough to protect what we care about. They reached the edge of the market district. Early risers were beginning to set up stalls, life continuing despite everything happening in shadows. Tomorrow, Vaelor continued, Parliament reconvenes to discuss the failed execution. Your brother will present his evidence. He will call for investigations. He will try to turn tonight's confrontation into proof that I am dangerous. And we counter how? By presenting evidence of our own. The coalition documents we seized during Ashborn's attack. The financial records proving House Vael was funding the trafficking networks they claim to oppose. Everything we need to prove your family is exactly as corrupt as the people I executed. Seraphine stopped walking. You have had that evidence the entire time. Yes. You let me go to that warehouse knowing it was a trap, knowing my brother would threaten me, knowing I would see exactly what House Vael was willing to do. Is he come? Yes, because you needed me to choose you over them with absolute certainty. Needed me to witness their betrayal directly so I would support whatever you did next without hesitation. Vaelor turned to face her fully. Yes. She stared at him. That is monstrous. You risked my life to secure my loyalty. I risked your life because I trusted you could survive it, and because I needed you to understand that your family was never going to let you remain neutral, that choosing them meant betraying me, and choosing me meant accepting everything that comes with that choice. So you manipulated me, again. I gave you information and let you make decisions. That is not manipulation. That is providing clarity. Seraphine wanted to be angry, wanted to rage at him for turning her into a piece on his board again, but beneath the anger was something more complicated. Acknowledgement that he was right, that she had needed to see her family's true nature, had needed to face the reality that they valued power more than her, had needed that confrontation to finally burn away any remaining doubt about which side she belonged on. I hate that you are right, she said quietly. I know. I hate that you understand me well enough to predict how I would respond to trauma. I know that too. And I hate that despite all of this, I am going to help you destroy my family. Vaelor's expression softened fractionally. You do not have to. I can handle House Vael alone. No. Seraphine took his hand. If we are doing this, we do it together. My family made their choice. Now I make mine. Completely. Without reservation. Without doubt. You understand what that means? Once we start this, there is no going back. You will be choosing me over blood, over history, over everything you were raised to believe mattered. I understand perfectly. She met his eyes. And I choose you, the monster, the tyrant, the man who came alone to trade himself for me. They stood in the market district as dawn broke across Ironhaven. Two people who had been forced together by politics, who had nearly been torn apart by family, who had discovered that sometimes the strongest bonds were the ones forged in fire rather than comfort. Tomorrow, Vaelor said, we burn down everything that threatens us. Are you ready for that? Seraphine thought about her brother's betrayal, about being used as bait, about watching her family prioritize power over her life, about the man beside her who had risked everything to ensure she survived. Yes, she said simply. I am ready. They walked toward the Parliament building together. Behind them, in the Harbor District, coalition forces dispersed into shadows, preparing for the war they had just declared, gathering evidence, coordinating with allies, building the case they would present when morning came, unaware that Vaelor and Seraphine had just become something more dangerous than a duke and his wife. They had become partners who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. And in the halls of power, there was no force more terrifying than two people who had decided that burning everything down was acceptable cost for protecting each other. Parliament convened at dawn. The Grand Assembly Hall filled with bodies before the sun fully breached the horizon. Every seat occupied. Every corridor packed with observers who could not gain entry but refused to miss witnessing history. The air itself felt compressed, thick with anticipation that preceded either revolution or revelation. No one was certain which. Lord Chancellor Voss called the session to order with a gavel strike that echoed like a gunshot through the acoustically perfect chamber. His face showed every one of his 70 years, lines carved by decades of political service, eyes that had seen kingdoms rise and fall, a mouth that had long ago forgotten how to smile without calculation. He was tired. Tired of the game, tired of watching ambitious men destroy each other, tired of pretending that any of this served purposes beyond accumulating power. But duty was duty. And his duty was facilitating the mechanisms of governance, regardless of whether those mechanisms produced justice or simply produced winners. Duke Vaelor Blackthorne sat in his designated position at the front of the hall, Seraphine beside him. Both wore formal attire that somehow managed to communicate authority without ostentation. Black and deep blue. Silver accents. Clothing designed to remind everyone watching that they represented Ravaryn's oldest power structures, even as those structures threatened to collapse. Across the chamber, Lord Adrian Vael occupied the opposition platform. Behind him, 12 representatives from Southern coalition houses. Men and women who had survived Ashborn's failed coup and decided the lesson was not to stop conspiring, but to conspire more carefully. They looked confident, certain. They had evidence. They had testimony. They had spent the night preparing presentations designed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Duke Blackthorne had become the exact threat to democracy that justified extraordinary measures. What they did not have was understanding of who they were actually facing. Lord Chancellor Voss began. His voice carried without amplification, trained through 5 decades to fill spaces designed to swallow sound. We gather today to address accusations of tyranny, abuse of power, and systematic violation of parliamentary authority by Duke Vaelor Blackthorne. Lord Adrian Vael of House Vael has petitioned for emergency session to present evidence requiring immediate consideration. The accused has right to respond. Let us proceed with dignity appropriate to the gravity of these charges. Adrian stood. He moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent his entire life in political arenas. Confident stride. Perfect posture. The physical embodiment of aristocratic virtue. He was very good at performing righteousness. Probably believed it was genuine. Members of Parliament, he began, voice pitched to convey both sorrow and determination. I come before you today not as enemy of Duke Blackthorne, but as concerned citizen who can no longer ignore patterns of authoritarian consolidation that threaten everything Ravaryn represents. I present not opinions, but documented evidence of systematic abuse. He gestured. An assistant brought forward the first set of documents. Over the past 6 weeks, Duke Blackthorne has executed nobility without trial, seized property through intimidation, and used emergency powers to bypass parliamentary oversight. He claims these actions serve Ravaryn's stability. I submit that they serve only his personal dominance. Adrian held up a ledger. Financial records showing asset seizures. Names of noble families who had lost lands. Dates correlating with Blackthorne's consolidation of authority. This is not governance. This is robbery legitimized through fear, and it represents fundamental betrayal of democratic principles Ravaryn was founded upon. Murmurs rippled through the assembled parliament. Not quite agreement, not quite dissent. The sound of people processing information and calculating which direction to lean once verdicts became inevitable. Adrian continued, building his case piece by piece. More documents, more testimony. Witnesses who described intimidation. Magistrates who confirmed procedures were violated. A systematic presentation designed to create undeniable narrative. Duke Blackthorne has become the very tyranny we established Parliament to prevent. He paused for effect. Let that statement settle. Then delivered the killing blow. And my sister, Lady Seraphine Blackthorne, has been complicit in every action. Not as victim, not as unwilling participant, but as active collaborator who understood exactly what she was enabling. Seraphine felt every eye in the chamber turned toward her, felt the weight of judgment that came before trials, felt her brother weaponizing their relationship with surgical precision designed to hurt her while destroying Vaelor. Adrian produced more documents, correspondence between Seraphine and various parliamentary members discussing reforms, policy proposals she had drafted, security briefings she had attended. Each piece of evidence was real. Each could be interpreted as either dutiful participation or active conspiracy, depending on framing. Her brother chose conspiracy framing. My sister arrived in Ravaryn advocating for progressive change. Instead, she became enabler for regressive authoritarianism. She attended meetings where executions were planned. She signed documents authorizing seizures. She stood beside Duke Blackthorne while he dismantled democratic institutions. He looked directly at Seraphine, expression conveying perfect mixture of disappointment and concern. I love my sister, but I cannot protect her from consequences of choices she made knowingly. If we are to restore legitimate governance, we must hold accountable not just the tyrant, but those who enabled his rise. The chamber erupted, nobles shouting, factions arguing, Lord Chancellor Voss banging his gavel repeatedly trying to restore order that had already fractured beyond easy repair. Through it all, Vaelor sat motionless, had not moved since Adrian began, had not reacted to any accusation, had simply watched with the patient intensity of someone waiting for the right moment to strike. Seraphine recognized that stillness, had seen it before. It was not passivity. It was predator allowing prey to position themselves exactly where he wanted them before revealing the trap had already closed. Order was eventually restored. Lord Chancellor Voss looked at Vaelor with expression that suggested he expected denial, justification, legal maneuvering designed to delay inevitable judgment. Duke Blackthorne, he said formally, you have heard accusations. How do you respond? Vaelor stood slowly, not hurried, not defensive, with the measured deliberation of someone who had already won and was simply allowing everyone else to realize it. Lord Chancellor, members of Parliament, I will not insult your intelligence by denying Lord Vael's accusations. The executions occurred. The seizures occurred. The consolidation of authority occurred. These are facts. The chamber went silent. Everyone had expected rebuttals, legal arguments, procedural challenges, not admission. What Lord Vael fails to understand, Vaelor continued, voice cutting through the silence like precision instrument, is that I do not require his permission to exercise authority I already possess. That I do not answer to noble families who mistake their privileges for rights. That everything I have done was not violation of law, but execution of law against those who believed themselves exempt. He began walking along the edge of his platform, forcing Parliament to turn and follow his movement, controlling attention through simple physicality. Lord Vael presents my actions as tyranny. I present them as pest control. as necessary elimination of corrupt systems that had operated unchallenged for decades because everyone in this chamber was too comfortable to demand accountability. Vaelor stopped, turned to face Adrian directly. Your brother speaks of restoring legitimate governance, speaks of democratic principles, speaks of protecting Ravaryn from authoritarianism. Let us examine how committed House Vael actually is to those principles. He nodded toward the rear doors. They opened. What entered was not guards, not soldiers, not even witnesses prepared to deliver testimony. It was children, 43 of them, ages ranging from 6 to 16, wearing clean clothing provided by Ravaryn's treasury, accompanied by caretakers, moving through the Grand Assembly Hall with the uncertain steps of people who had been told they were safe but did not quite believe it yet. The chamber erupted into confused shouting. Voss banged his gavel. Adrian's face went gray. These children, Vaelor said quietly, were recovered from labor camps operated by houses Caldwell, Thane, and Wexford. Camps that existed for 8 years. Camps that multiple noble families knew about and chose to ignore because confronting them was politically inconvenient. He gestured toward Adrian, including House Vael, who received quarterly reports about the camps from their intelligence operatives, who understood exactly what was occurring, who made calculated decision that exposing the trafficking would destabilize coalitions they were building to oppose my authority. Documents were distributed throughout the chamber, intelligence reports bearing House Vael's seal, financial records showing payments to camp operators, correspondence between Adrian and family advisors explicitly discussing whether exposing the camps served their strategic interests. The conclusion they reached, Vaelor continued, was that children's suffering mattered less than maintaining political alliances, that justice could be delayed indefinitely in service of accumulating power to challenge me. He turned to face the full parliament. So when Lord Vael stands before you preaching democratic virtue, understand what he actually means. He means democracy for nobility, process for the privileged, rights for those wealthy enough to purchase protection. Everyone else can suffer quietly as long as their suffering serves his ambitions. Adrian found his voice. Those documents are taken out of context. My family was investigating independently. We intended to act once we had sufficient evidence. For 8 years, Vaelor's voice was ice. You intended to act for 8 years while children were sold like livestock? How much more evidence did you require, Lord Vael? How many more victims needed to suffer before investigation became inconvenient enough to justify action? The children stood silent throughout this exchange. Their presence was evidence more powerful than any testimony, breathing proof that the conflict between Duke and Lord was never about principles. It was about which brand of ruthlessness Parliament found more palatable. The brutal honesty of someone who admitted his methods were harsh, or the comfortable lies of someone who wrapped cruelty in progressive language and called it strategy. Seraphine watched her brother's face cycle through expressions: shock, fury, desperate calculation. He had come prepared to destroy Vaelor politically, had not anticipated that Vaelor would destroy him morally by simply exposing truth everyone had been complicit in ignoring. But you executed those lords without trial, Adrian managed, without due process. That is still tyranny, regardless of their crimes. Vaelor smiled. It was not pleasant. I executed them quickly, cleanly, after presenting evidence before Parliament and allowing debate, which is infinitely more process than they afforded their victims, and infinitely more mercy than they deserved. He gestured toward the children again. These 43 were recovered during chaos of Ashborn's attack. Do you know how many more died in those camps before we found them? 71. 71 children who would still be alive if people in this chamber had prioritized justice over political convenience. The weight of that number settled across the assembly like physical pressure. 71. Not abstract casualties, not statistical victims. 71 individual lives that could have been saved if anyone with power had chosen to act instead of calculate. So yes, Vaelor said quietly, I am ruthless, I am brutal. I consolidate authority and use it without hesitation. But I use it to eliminate threats everyone else tolerates, to enact justice everyone else delays, to make decisions everyone else is too afraid to make. He looked directly at Lord Chancellor Voss. That is not tyranny, that is leadership. And if Parliament wishes to condemn me for it, then condemn me. But do so honestly. Admit you are protecting your own privileges rather than defending democratic principles. The chamber fell into absolute silence. Every member of Parliament understood they were witnessing something fundamental. Not just political theater, not just adversaries trading accusations, but exposure of the rot beneath Ravaryn's entire governance structure. The uncomfortable truth that the system functioned through carefully maintained ignorance of its own failures. Vaelor was not just defending himself, he was forcing everyone present to acknowledge their own complicity, to recognize that opposing him meant defending the very corruption he had eliminated. It was masterful, brutal, undeniably effective, and it left Adrian with absolutely no meaningful response. Lord Chancellor Voss cleared his throat. The documents presented by Duke Blackthorne appear authentic. House Vael's intelligence services did indeed possess knowledge of the trafficking operations. The question before Parliament is whether this evidence justifies Duke Blackthorne's methods, or simply proves all parties involved share culpability. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Political survival depended on not being on the wrong side when verdicts crystallized into historical record. However, Voss continued, there remains the matter of Lady Seraphine's involvement. Lord Vael has presented evidence of her participation in governance decisions. That evidence has not been adequately addressed. Vaelor turned to Seraphine. Something passed between them. Not spoken, not even gestured, just mutual understanding that the next moment would define everything that followed. Seraphine stood, every eye in the chamber locked onto her. The Duchess who had been accused of complicity, who stood at the intersection of two competing narratives, who could either confirm or destroy her husband's defense depending on what she said next. She walked forward slowly. Not to Vaelor's platform, not to Adrian's, to the neutral space between them where Lord Chancellor Voss presided. When she spoke, her voice was clear, steady, absent of the nervousness that should have been present for someone facing accusations this serious. Lord Chancellor, members of Parliament. My brother is correct. I participated in governance decisions. I attended meetings. I signed documents. I stood beside Duke Blackthorne while he implemented policies I had previously opposed. She paused. Let that admission settle, then continued. I did these things not because I was coerced, not because I was manipulated, but because I chose to, because I arrived in Ravaryn believing compassion could reform brutal systems. And I learned that brutal systems do not respond to compassion. They respond to force. Seraphine turned to face her brother directly. When I married Duke Blackthorne, you told me I was making a mistake, that I would regret aligning myself with a tyrant, that I should maintain distance and wait for opportunities to undermine his authority from within. Adrian's expression confirmed the truth of that statement even before he could deny it. You wanted me to be spy, Seraphine said quietly, to marry him and betray him, to provide House Vael with intelligence we could use to destroy him politically. And when I refused, when I chose to actually stand beside my husband instead of sabotaging him, you decided I had become liability rather than asset. She held up her own document, correspondence between Adrian and their father, discussing exactly this strategy, debating whether Seraphine could be trusted to maintain dual loyalty or whether she needed to be eliminated as potential weakness. The documents were dated, sealed, unambiguous. My family, Seraphine said, voice carrying pain beneath the control, planned my removal before I even arrived at Blackthorne Keep. Not because they feared for my safety, because they feared I would not serve their ambitions. And when their fears proved accurate, they weaponized me against the man I chose. She turned back to Parliament. So yes, I am complicit in Duke Blackthorne's governance, proudly, consciously, because I would rather stand beside someone honest about brutality than people who dress their manipulation in concern. The chamber remained silent, processing, calculating, recognizing that Seraphine had just burned every bridge to her family publicly while simultaneously confirming her husband's narrative. Adrian found his voice. You have been corrupted. He cannot see it, but everyone else can. You arrived here with principles and abandoned them for a man who sees you as possession rather than partner. No, Seraphine said firmly. I arrived here with ideals, and I learned that ideals without power are just wishes that evaporate under pressure. Duke Blackthorne did not corrupt me. He showed me what governance actually requires when you refuse to hide behind comfortable fictions. She moved closer to her brother, close enough that she could see the fury and betrayal in his eyes, close enough that her next words would land with physical weight. You wanted me to be your weapon, and when I refused, you tried to destroy me. That is not protection, Adrian. That is ownership.
The exact thing you accuse Vaelor of. The only difference is that he admits what he is. You lie to yourself and call it virtue. Adrian raised his hand. For a moment, everyone thought he might strike her, his fingers curled into fist. Body tensing with rage that had nowhere to go except inward, where it would fester and poison everything it touched. Then he lowered his hand, expression collapsing into something that looked like genuine grief beneath the political calculation. "You are my sister," he said quietly, "and I have lost you to a monster." "No," Seraphine replied. "You lost me when you decided I was tool rather than person. Vaelor may be monster, but he is honest monster who treats me as equal rather than asset. And I will take honest brutality over masked manipulation every single time." She turned away, returned to Vaelor's side, stood close enough that their shoulders touched. United front. Absolute statement of loyalty that left no ambiguity about which side she had chosen. Lord Chancellor Voss looked older than he had at session's beginning, as if witnessing this exchange had aged him in real time. He banged his gavel once, purely ceremonial. The verdict was already obvious to everyone present. In light of evidence presented, he said slowly, "Parliament finds that Duke Blackthorne's actions, while severe, were justified by circumstances. The trafficking networks required immediate dismantling. Emergency powers were appropriately applied, and accusations of tyranny are insufficient to warrant removal from authority." He paused, drew breath, delivered the second part that would satisfy no one and infuriate everyone equally. However, Parliament also finds that Duke Blackthorne's consolidation of authority has proceeded to extent requiring oversight. Emergency powers are hereby rescinded. Standard parliamentary procedures will resume, and Duke Blackthorne will submit quarterly reports justifying any extraordinary actions. It was compromise. Perfect political middle ground that gave Vaelor victory while constraining his methods. That acknowledged corruption while refusing to fully confront it. That satisfied neither side completely, and therefore satisfied institutional need for balance. Vaelor accepted it with single nod. He had known this was likely outcome, had prepared for exactly this result, trading some authority for validation of his methods, accepting constraints in exchange for legitimacy. The children were escorted from the chamber, their presence no longer needed once they had served purpose. Living evidence that became inconvenient reminder once political theater concluded. Parliament adjourned. Members filed out with expressions ranging from relief to frustration to carefully masked calculation about what this verdict meant for their own ambitions. Adrian remained standing on his platform, alone now. Representatives from coalition houses had already departed, distancing themselves from someone who had just lost high-stakes confrontation publicly. He stared at Seraphine across the empty chamber, not with hatred, with something more complicated. The look of someone realizing they had underestimated opponent and overestimated their own righteousness. Then he left, without words, without threats. Just walking away from battlefield he had chosen and lost. Seraphine watched him go, felt something break inside her chest. Not regret, but acknowledgement that choosing Vaelor had cost her family permanently, that there would be no reconciliation, no eventual understanding, just permanent severance from people who shared her blood but not her values. Vaelor's hand found hers, squeezed gently, not speaking, just offering silent support while she processed loss that victory had required. They stood together in the empty Grand Assembly Hall. Two people who had survived conspiracy, invasion, betrayal, and political crucifixion, who had emerged technically victorious but fundamentally changed by everything they had endured. "We won," Seraphine said quietly. "We survived," Vaelor corrected. "That is not quite the same thing. What is the difference? Winning implies we kept everything we wanted. We did not. I surrendered emergency powers. You lost your family. We both compromised pieces of ourselves to reach this point. That is not victory. That is just successful damage control." Seraphine absorbed that, the honesty beneath the words. The refusal to pretend triumph was clean when it was actually messy and expensive and stained with concessions neither had wanted to make. "What happens now?" she asked. Vaelor considered the question. "Now we rebuild. Blackthorne Keep. Our reputations. The governance structures Parliament will spend next decade trying to constrain. We establish new normal where I am watched closely but still functional, where you are recognized as partner rather than decoration, where we operate within narrower boundaries than before but operate effectively nonetheless.
That sounds exhausting. It will be. His hand tightened on hers. But we do it together. That was the deal. You stand beside me through consequences. I trust you with authority to implement reforms I would not choose independently. We balance each other's worst impulses while supporting each other's necessary actions. And if we fail, then we fail spectacularly, and everyone who predicted our destruction gets satisfaction of being correct. His voice carried dark humor. But I have spent 10 years succeeding against worse odds. And you have survived 2 months in an environment designed to break you. We are both more resilient than people assume. They walked toward the chamber exits, toward sunlight that seemed almost too bright after hours in artificially lit political arena, toward whatever version of future they had just negotiated through violence and revelation and uncomfortable truths. Outside, Thrace waited. The advisor looked exhausted, probably had not slept in days. But his expression showed something that might have been approval beneath the professional neutrality. Your Grace, my lady. The carriage is prepared. Blackthorne Keep's reconstruction supervisors require decisions about the Northern Tower, and several parliamentary delegations have requested meetings this afternoon. Vaelor nodded. Schedule the meetings. Tell reconstruction to proceed with plans we discussed last week, and arrange for those children to be placed with families who have been vetted thoroughly. I want updates weekly on their welfare. Understood, Your Grace? Thrace hesitated. If I may, that was masterfully handled. Both of you. We destroyed a man's reputation and severed family ties publicly, Seraphine said. That is not something I feel proud of. The advisor's expression softened slightly. You exposed corruption and protected each other. In my experience, those are the actions worth pride. The rest is just cost of operating in this world. He departed, leaving Vaelor and Seraphine standing on Parliament steps, looking out over Ironhaven, over the city that represented Ravaryn's political heart, over the kingdom they had just secured at such tremendous personal expense. Do you think we are good people? Seraphine asked suddenly. Vaelor did not answer immediately. Considered the question with same seriousness he applied to strategic calculations. No, he said finally. Good people do not make the choices we make. Do not calculate suffering as acceptable cost. Do not weaponize children's trauma to win political battles, even when that weaponization serves just purposes. Then what are we? Necessary people. Brutal people. People willing to do things that need doing when everyone else is too afraid or too comfortable to act. His voice was quiet but certain. History will probably condemn us, but history is written by those with luxury of distance. We do not have that luxury. We operate in present where choices are never between good and evil, only between functional and catastrophic. Seraphine leaned against his shoulder. That is depressing philosophy. That is honest philosophy, and honesty is all we have left after stripping away everything else. They stood silent for a long moment, watching the city move below them, people living normal lives, conducting business, raising families, existing in the peace that came from never needing to understand the brutal mechanisms that maintain that peace. Vaelor envied them, not for their innocence, but for their ability to live without carrying weight of decisions that shaped kingdoms, without waking every morning knowing that choices made today would haunt them indefinitely. But envy was indulgence he could not afford, and neither could Seraphine. They had chosen different path, harder path that required accepting darkness as constant companion rather than occasional visitor. The carriage arrived. They climbed inside, began the journey back toward Blackthorne Keep, toward the castle being rebuilt from ashes, toward the life they would construct within whatever boundaries Parliament had just imposed. Do you regret it? Vaelor asked as the carriage rolled through city streets. Choosing me, losing your family, becoming someone capable of what you did today. Seraphine thought about her brother's face, about childhood memories that would now forever be tainted by betrayal, about the version of herself that had arrived at Blackthorne Keep 2 months ago, believing compassion could reform brutal systems. That version was dead, had been systematically dismantled through violence and revelation and harsh truths that could not be unlearned once witnessed. I regret what it cost, she said slowly. But I do not regret the choice itself. You showed me that effectiveness matters more than intentions, that results justify methods when alternatives mean accepting worse outcomes, that sometimes the most ethical position is the one willing to get blood on its hands. You sound like me. I know. That should terrify me more than it does. Vaelor pulled her closer. It terrifies me enough for both of us. The idea that I corrupted someone who arrived here with genuine principles, that I turned idealism into pragmatism, that I am reason you can now justify actions that would have horrified you months ago. But corruption assumes I became worse, Seraphine said. What if I just became more realistic, more capable of surviving in a world that does not reward virtue, more effective at implementing changes I still believe in, even if I now use different methods? That is rationalization. Perhaps. Or perhaps it is growth. Ugly growth. Painful growth. But growth nonetheless. The carriage passed through Market District, through neighborhoods where people glanced at the Blackthorne crest and quickly looked away, not because they hated him, but because they feared him, would always fear him. That fear was price of the authority he wielded. But some of those people now had children who had been rescued from camps, had family members who benefited from land redistribution, had opportunities that existed only because Vaelor had been willing to destroy corrupt systems everyone else tolerated. They would never thank him, would never view him as hero, but they survived and sometimes thrived because of choices he made. And that had to be enough, because gratitude was luxury. Tyrants could not expect, regardless of whether their tyranny served useful purposes. The carriage reached Blackthorne Keep's outer grounds. Even from distance, the damage was visible. Northern tower still mostly rubble, western wing covered in scaffolding, southern barracks being rebuilt from foundation. The castle looked wounded, like it had been in battle and survived, but would carry scars permanently. Appropriate metaphor. Workers paused as the carriage approached, nodding respectfully, returning to labor. The reconstruction was proceeding ahead of schedule. Vaelor had ensured generous pay and safe conditions, not from compassion, from understanding that loyalty was purchased through fair treatment more effectively than demanded through fear. He was learning, slowly, painfully, but learning nonetheless that some of Seraphine's principles had merit even within his brutal framework, that carrots could supplement sticks, that people worked harder when they believed their labor mattered beyond simply avoiding punishment. The carriage stopped before the cathedral, the only section that had survived completely intact, stone that predated castle itself, that would probably outlast whatever came next. That represented continuity beyond individual reigns and personal conflicts. They exited, stood looking up at structure that had sheltered them during worst of the attack, that had served as sanctuary when everything else burned. This will be our actual residence until Northern Wing is complete, Vaelor said. The cathedral has chambers designed for exactly this purpose. Not comfortable, but functional. I do not need comfortable, Seraphine replied. I need honest. And this place is that. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. Like us. Like us. They entered the cathedral together, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness, light streaming through windows that had survived 200 years of history, dust particles floating in air that smelled of old stone and older memories. At the altar, where they had fought beside each other during the attack, Vaelor stopped, turned to face Seraphine fully. I need to say something, he began. Without calculation, without strategy, just truth. She waited. I told myself you were political necessity, that keeping you was pragmatic decision, that what I felt was possession rather than connection. He took her hands. But that was lie, I told myself, because admitting otherwise meant acknowledging vulnerability I could not afford. His voice dropped. You changed me, Seraphine, not into something better, but into something more complete. You gave me reason to care about outcomes beyond survival, to consider consequences beyond political advantage, to remember that the kingdom I protect is made of people rather than just resources. You are still brutal, she said quietly. I know. And I will continue to be brutal when situations require it, but now that brutality serves something beyond my own dominance, it serves future where maybe my methods become less necessary because structures are stronger, where someone less ruthless can maintain what we build because foundation is solid enough to not require constant violent defense. That is almost optimistic. Do not get used to it. His mouth curved slightly. But occasionally in moments like this, I allow myself to believe that what we are doing matters, that the cost was justified, that we might actually build something worth the pieces we sacrificed to construct it. Seraphine reached up, touched his face gently. This man who had destroyed kingdoms rather than surrender, who had admitted vulnerability as if confessing mortal sin, who stood in cathedral light looking more human than he ever had in throne room darkness. I do not need you to be optimistic, she said. I need you to be honest. And you are. Ruthlessly, painfully, completely. That is why I chose you. That is why I will continue choosing you even when that choice is difficult. She leaned closer. You are not good man, Vaelor Blackthorne. You are necessary man, dangerous man. Man who will be remembered as tyrant regardless of what you actually accomplish. But you are my man, my partner, my choice. And I will stand beside your throne until one of us falls. Vaelor pulled her into embrace that was less gentle and more desperate than anything he had shown publicly, holding her like she was anchor preventing him from drifting into complete darkness. Like she represented humanity he could not access independently, but could touch through her presence. They stood together in the cathedral for a long time. No words, just presence. Just two people who had survived impossible odds by refusing to surrender each other, even when surrender was rational option. Outside, Ravaryn continued its revolution around the sun. Inside, Duke and Duchess began the slow work of rebuilding. Not just castle, not just reputations, but themselves. The versions of themselves that could survive what they had endured and still function, still govern, still make brutal choices without completely losing sight of why those choices mattered. It would not be easy. Nothing about their partnership was easy. They fought constantly, disagreed fundamentally, operated from incompatible philosophies that created constant tension. But that tension was creative rather than destructive. It forced both of them to justify positions, to articulate reasoning, to recognize that neither possessed monopoly on truth, that effective governance required balance between brutality and compassion, between decisiveness and consideration, between maintaining authority and accepting oversight. They were not good people, would never be good people. Too much blood on their hands, too many compromises with conscience, too many decisions that haunted them in quiet moments. But they were effective people, necessary people, people willing to carry weight that others could not bear so that kingdom could function, so that children could be rescued, so that corrupt systems could be dismantled, even when dismantling required methods that history would condemn. And in the end, effectiveness mattered more than virtue. Results justified methods. Survival trumped sentiment. Those were harsh truths, uncomfortable truths, truths that would make them villains in stories told generations hence. But they were truths nonetheless. And Vaelor and Seraphine had built their partnership on foundation of accepting truth regardless of cost, of refusing comfortable lies, of looking at darkness without flinching and deciding darkness could be navigated rather than avoided. That was their legacy. Not kindness, not compassion, not the virtues people wrote poems about, but the brutal pragmatism that allowed kingdoms to survive when faced with threats that virtue alone could not counter. History would not forgive them. Future generations would not understand them. They would be remembered as cautionary tale about what happened when power concentrated in wrong hands. But those hands kept Ravaryn functional, kept children safe, kept systems operating even when those systems required constant violent maintenance. And that had to be enough, because there was no one else willing to do the work, no one else capable of making decisions that required sacrificing pieces of soul for greater stability. As sunset painted the cathedral windows gold and crimson, Vaelor and Seraphine stood together, watching light transform stone into something almost beautiful, almost transcendent, almost worthy of the brutal foundation required to support it. Tomorrow, they would return to governance, to parliament sessions, to endless negotiations with people who would spend decades trying to constrain their authority, to the grinding daily work of maintaining kingdom through mixture of force and compromise. But tonight they allowed themselves a moment of peace, of recognition that they had survived when everyone predicted their destruction, that they had found partnership when everyone assumed only predator and prey could exist between them, that they had built something functional from ruins everyone else had written off as unsalvageable. It was not happy ending. Happy endings were fiction designed to comfort rather than illuminate. This was functional ending, realistic ending, ending that acknowledged cost while accepting necessity, ending that validated brutal choices while refusing to glorify them. Ending that was honest, and honesty was all they had ever promised each other. The cathedral bells began ringing. Not alarm bells, not victory bells, just evening bells marking time passing regardless of human drama. Marking that another day had concluded, that Ravaryn had survived one more rotation, that tomorrow would bring new challenges requiring same brutal calculations. Vaelor turned to Seraphine, extended his hand formally, as if asking for dance rather than partnership and governance that would define both their lives. She took his hand without hesitation, without doubt, with full understanding of what acceptance meant, what it would continue to mean, what it would cost over years and decades of operating in spaces where moral clarity dissolved into pragmatic necessity. Together, they walked from the cathedral into gathering darkness, toward castle being rebuilt from ashes, toward future they would construct through mixture of force and strategy and careful compromises, toward legacy that would be judged harshly but would function effectively. Above them, stars emerged, indifferent witnesses to human struggles that seemed monumental from ground level but were barely visible from cosmic distance, reminding them that their choices, however consequential, were still just choices made by flawed people trying to navigate impossible situations with insufficient information and excessive conviction. But those choices shaped kingdom, protected citizens, created stability that allowed normal life to continue for people who would never know how close they had come to collapse. And that was purpose. That was meaning. That was justification for carrying weight that would otherwise crush anyone who attempted it alone. Vaelor and Seraphine did not carry it alone. They carried it together. Two people who should have destroyed each other, discovering that sometimes the most dangerous partnerships were the ones that actually worked. That effectiveness could emerge from conflict. That strength could build from mutual recognition of weakness. They were not heroes. History would make that clear. They were survivors who became rulers, who became something more complicated than either term captured. They were people who faced darkness and decided that fighting from within was more effective than condemning from outside, who accepted contamination as price of enacting change, who learned that you could not reform systems without first understanding why those systems had developed their brutal edges. The northern wind picked up, carrying scent of ocean and pine and smoke from reconstruction fires still burning, carrying promise of winter approaching, of seasons turning regardless of political upheaval, of time passing whether humans used it wisely or squandered it on conflicts that would seem meaningless from future perspective. But perspective was luxury they could not afford. They operated in present where every decision mattered, where mistakes cost lives, where weakness invited predators who would destroy everything if given opportunity, where the only defense was being more ruthless than enemies while maintaining enough humanity to remember why ruthlessness served purpose beyond itself. That was the balance they would spend their lives maintaining. The impossible balance between monster and man, between necessity and excess, between protecting kingdom and becoming threat themselves. It was balance that could never be perfect, could only be approached through constant vigilance and mutual correction, through partnership that acknowledged neither possessed complete truth and therefore required others' perspective to avoid catastrophic error. As they entered Blackthorne Keep's cathedral residence, as doors closed behind them, shutting out the world temporarily, as they prepared to face whatever tomorrow brought, one truth remained absolute. They had chosen each other, completely, irrevocably, with full understanding of cost and full commitment to paying it. And that choice, more than any political victory or strategic triumph, was what would define them. Not the kingdom they ruled, not the enemies they destroyed, not the systems they maintained through brutal efficiency, but the fact that two people fundamentally unsuited for partnership had forged one anyway, had refused to break when breaking would have been easier, had built something functional from materials everyone else considered incompatible. That was their story. Not pretty, not comfortable, not the tale anyone would choose if given option, but theirs nonetheless. Honest, brutal, necessary, and enduring in ways that softer stories could never achieve. The Blackthorne legacy would continue, changed, constrained, watched carefully by Parliament that had learned painful lesson about granting unlimited authority, but functional, effective, serving purposes that mattered even if methods remained controversial. And at its center would stand Duke and Duchess, who had learned that survival required brutality, brutality required justification, and justification required partnership with someone willing to demand better even while accepting necessary. They were not good people. They were necessary people, and sometimes, in kingdoms balanced on knife edge between chaos and order, necessary was the highest virtue available. History would judge them harshly. They accepted that judgment in advance, but they would continue regardless, because someone had to do the work. Someone had to make brutal choices. Someone had to carry weight that would otherwise crush entire populations beneath its pressure. They were those someones, by choice, by necessity, by recognition that refusing the burden meant watching it destroy people less capable of bearing it.
And so they endured,
Together, through everything that came next, through storms that would make these trials seem trivial, through victories and defeats and compromises that would test every boundary they established, through years and decades of operating in shadows where normal people feared to tread, they endured. Not because they were strong, but because they were unwilling to be weak. Not because they were virtuous, but because they understood that effectiveness mattered more than appearance. Not because they were loved, but because they protected those who could not protect themselves, even when those people would never thank them for protection. That was enough. It had to be enough, because there was nothing else, no other path, no other choice that honored commitments they had made to each other and to kingdom they had sworn to preserve. The cathedral bells finished their evening song. Silence returned. And in that silence, Duke Vaelor Blackthorne and Duchess Seraphine Blackthorne began the rest of their lives together. Not happily, but honestly. And sometimes, in a world as brutal as theirs, honesty was the only form of happiness that endured.